All right, I'd like to call to order the April the 8th, 2026 meeting of the Open Space Board of Trustees. We'll start with a roll call of the members present. To my left, Brady.
Here.
And to my right, Morgan, who's a new member.
Oops, here.
I'm Harmon Zuckerman, and online, John.
Present. Can you all hear me?
Nice to see you. Yep. Okay, so the first order of business tonight is the swearing in of our new trustee, Morgan Lomley. And you have the copy of the oath with you?
I do.
Okay, would you please read that aloud into the record?
I will. I, Morgan Lomley, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States of America and of the state of Colorado and the charter and ordinances of the city of Boulder, and faithfully perform the duties of the office of a member of the Open Space Board of Trustees, which I'm about to enter.
Thank you. And Morgan was appointed by City Council last month, and we welcome her to the board. Third order of business on the agenda is OSBT officer elections. And I'm going to start by nominating John Carroll for chair, Brady Robinson for vice, and for secretary. Dan, do you want to continue being secretary? If so, I will nominate you as the secretary.
Leah Russell is our current secretary.
Oh, is she still our secretary? I'm sorry, Leah.
She is.
Okay, it had been Dan before and I just forgot. Okay, so Leah, I will nominate you as secretary. So the nomination is, again, John Carroll chair, Brady Robinson vice chair, and Leah Russell as secretary with apologies, sorry, Leah. Is there anybody on the board who would like to turn those nominations into a motion?
I'll move to approve the appointments.
Okay, so we have a motion. Do we have a second for that slate of officers?
I'll second.
Okay. Then the board moves that the Open Space Board of Trustees appoint John Carroll as chair, Brady Robinson as vice chair, and Leah Russell as secretary.
Harmon,
Moved by Lomley and seconded by Robinson. We'll take a roll call vote. Mr. Carroll.
Yes.
Mr. Robinson.
Yes.
Ms. Lomley.
Yes.
And I vote yes. So we have 4-0. All members present voting in favor of that. So I would love to throw this gavel at you, but it would break a television. So I'll turn the meeting over to you now, John, and you're the new chair. Congratulations.
Awesome. Thanks, Harmon. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, which I believe is the approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. So we'll go through it page by page here. Does anyone have changes on the first page of the minutes? All right, hearing none, we'll move on to the second page. Anyone have changes on the second page? All right, hearing none, we'll move on to the third page. Any changes to the third page of the minutes? All right, hearing none, would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes from the March 11th, 2026 board meeting?
Yeah, I move that we approve the March 11th, 2026 Open Space Board meeting minutes.
I'll second that. All right. We'll do a roll call vote. Morgan, you're abstaining since you weren't at the meeting. Harmon?
Yes.
Brady?
Yes.
And I will vote yes as well. So that's a 3-0 vote with one abstention. All right, next we'll move on to public comment. Sam, are you going to read the rules of decorum for us today?
Yes, thank you. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and OSBT, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, please visit this link. The city will enforce the rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code, including participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. No attendee shall disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any city meeting in a manner that obstructs the business of the meeting. This also includes failing to obey any lawful order of the presiding officer to leave the meeting room or refrain from addressing the board. Only one person at a time at the podium, unless an accommodation like an interpreter is required. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No standing in or otherwise blocking the aisles in violation of the fire code or in a way that obstructs the vision or audio of other audience members. No signs or flags shall be permitted in council chambers except for one sign held by a person with the sign measuring no more than 11 by 17 inches, which is held no higher than the person's face. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. We ask that you not affix items to the podium or dais or walls or other surfaces of the chamber. Signs, flags, or other items used to communicate must be held by one person when displayed. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. In-person participants are asked to refrain from expressing support or disagreement verbally or with sounds such as applause or snapping, with the exception of declarations. Traditionally, support is shown through American Sign Language applause or jazz hands. If you are joining in person and would like to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing, I have your sign up here. If you're joining online, you can use the raise hand function to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing. You can do that using the raise hand icon or by clicking the participants icon, the three dots next to it on the bottom right, and then select raise hand. And I don't see anyone joining by phone, but I can go over those instructions if we do. And that is all. Thank you.
All right. Um, let's open public comment. Do we have anyone signed up?
We do. We have several folks signed up in advance. So I will go ahead and first to speak would be Alicia Curtin and then Robert Murphy. And Alicia, you can come up to the podium.
Good evening. First, thank you for your service and commitment to OSMP, what I consider to be the jewel of the city of Boulder. I'm Alicia Curtin, a mother of four, resident of the University Hill neighborhood, co-president of the University Hill Neighborhood Association, and a fire-adapted wildfire Colorado ambassador. A fire-adapted Colorado wildfire ambassador, excuse me. I also own and operate Desert Bloom Landscape Design, which specializes in drought-tolerant and fire-resistant landscaping here in the beautiful high desert of Boulder. I stand before you as a very invested and concerned resident and community organizer. The last 3 fires have occurred on OSMP land. I don't recall any lightning or electrical wires being close to these sites, so by deduction, the cause was human ignition. I believe the purview of human-caused ignition wildfires falls under the responsibility of OSMP, and when the parties responsible for starting the fires are found, I urge OSMP to work with the courts to consistently prosecute to the maximum penalty every single violation. Regarding fuel mitigation efforts, I would like OSMP and agencies within the city of Boulder to create and coordinate programming devoted to the mitigation of cross-boundary fuel management between OSMP and residents along the entirety of the WUI. I urge you to hire and dedicate personnel to this programming. I also urge you to ensure adequate staff can enforce trail closures on red flag days. I believe the highest priority area has a large grassland component, and as we know, grass is a dynamic fuel. I urge you to consider more staffing for grassland management. The Flagstaff area is a good example of the potential partnership between residents and OSMP. And to that end, I also believe greater public education is necessary, and a potential partnership with Boulder Fire and Rescue could be pursued to educate residents as to their part in the mitigation of that crossland area. I would also like OSMP to remain in control of the funds allotted to them and not have those funds commandeered by the city manager's office to fund other projects. I believe more transparency of the budget is needed and hope all city staff realizes the extraordinary importance of wildland fuel mitigation and why those funds need to remain as dedicated OSMP funds. In conclusion, if an urban conflagration occurs in the city via the WUI and it could have been prevented by better staffing or funding or collaborative programming, I fail to understand what other city programs have any relevance. This is a stated city priority, and it's about time it gets the attention, staffing, and programming it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia.
Okay. Next, we have Robert Murphy, followed by Steve Orr, and then Jan Burton. Yeah, and he was online. Okay, we might be coming back to Robert Murphy. Next would be Steve Orr, followed by Jan Burton. So Steve, you can come up to the podium.
All right, thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak here this evening. My name is Steve Orr. I'm a longtime resident and homeowner in the Table Mesa neighborhood. I'm also a 26-year veteran of the fire service, which included 2.5 years with Boulder Fire Rescue, during which I performed over 300 wildfire home assessments within the city. Wildfire preparedness and mitigation are my passion. I'm a subject matter expert. To be real frank, the city of Boulder faces significant risk of a catastrophic wildfire like the Marshall Fire and Lahaina, Tubbs, Paradise, Eaton, etc., which could easily kill residents and destroy hundreds, if not thousands, of homes. Our fire behavior and risk modeling expert with the State Forest Service has called Boulder, quote, the highest risk box in the state, unquote, and one of the highest risk communities in the world. Dr. Jennifer Balch at CU and her team have recently completed cutting edge research on what we call fast fires. They're in agreement as well. The greatest risk we face is a fast moving, wind driven fire spreading from OSMP property into the city due to the combination of flammable vegetation, structures, and the predominant west winds. I want to focus on fuel breaks and grasslands management. I'm very pleased to see all the hard work occurring on OSMP property. I'm in favor of continuing the perimeter mowing and grazing programs. I look forward to the Wonderland Lake and Shanahan Ridge cross-boundary fuel mitigation projects. I'm also in favor of prescribed fire, which I believe can be done safely and needs to occur. But back to perimeter mowing and the fuel breaks. I'm curious if there's any lessons learned from the pilot program and what is the plan moving forward. Specifically, I'd like staff to consider expanding the width of these fuel breaks. Why is this? Well, in response to the Marshall Fire, the Colorado State Forest Service worked collaboratively with experts in the field from the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network and the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange to develop guidelines for grasslands fuels management. And here's what they came up with. I quote, the minimum recommended fuel break width for wildfires is approximately 300 feet for level ground without taking into account additional factors like topography and local weather patterns within the forecasted fuel models. They also have a table of general guidelines which list 20 to 100 feet wide for moderate conditions and 100 to 300 feet wide for extreme conditions. OSMP is currently mowing and grazing to a width of 30 feet for those fuel breaks. I would argue this is insufficient. Given that 30 feet is on the very low end of moderate conditions, which are again 20 to 100, I would encourage OSMP to expand the width to 100 feet or greater. This would follow science-based best practices and help reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire entering the city via fast-moving grasslands fire, which is exactly how fire entered the communities during the Marshall and Lahaina fire with catastrophic results. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Next, so we'll go to Jan Burton, and then we'll go back to Robert Murphy, and then Robert Batchelder. So Jan.
Good evening, Council. I'm Jan Burton, OSMP advocate and volunteer. And I'm wearing my Trails Challenge pen tonight because I did complete it. Yay me! I am not in favor of the public realm tax. I feel like that's a money grab. And where is the big pot? It's OSMP, $42 million, I guess. For all of you, the budget must be reimagined to have a lot more dollars in feet on the street, caretaking for properties, and less money in things that would be considered overhead and not must-haves. This is a serious conversation for our trustees. The Open Space Board of Trustees must be involved in the budget. It's written in the charter. From now until approval, and you need to involve the taxpayers. That's why many of us are here. You need to push back against the city if they don't want to share that information. Now, today was a goat trail fire. I think I hiked that just a couple of months ago. And that's scary. We should all be shaking in our boots. That is the second one in 3 days. I have read the forest thinning and grassland management sites, and I think it is described extremely well. So hats off to your efforts there. Great descriptions and great details. But 175 acres is what I counted out of 46,000. It's not enough. And what we're doing is not moving quickly enough. So I believe I have an answer to the city's money grab. In other words, trying to get your money. We should use significant dollars for fire mitigation. Significant. I'm not a fire specialist, but it seems like ramping up to $8 million, $10 million is not out of the question until we are mitigated and safe. But we must have a science-based plan with goals and metrics and tracking mechanisms. For example, what percentage of our goal acreage has been mitigated? In other words, cleared, mowed, burned. And we must educate the public about why we are doing this. Removing trees is not popular, and some people don't understand why it's a must. People like me will spend time helping you. We care deeply. If only you would ask. You might consider something like a citizen budget committee that can help try to make decisions and balance priorities, must-haves versus nice-to-haves. Thank you so much for your service, and thank you to the entire staff of OSMP. And we look forward to hearing your progress on the budget and on fire mitigation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jan.
Next, we have Robert Murphy, followed by Robert Batchelder, and then Alan Delamere. Robert Murphy, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Should I go ahead and talk?
Yes, you can start.
Okay, my name is Dr. Robert Murphy. I live at 4075 57th Street in unincorporated Boulder County. I'm calling about an open space, city open space property located J and 63rd Street. It's on the southwest corner. I'm calling about the mesa to the south and west of the J and 63rd Street intersection. I don't know what the name of this open space property is, so I'll just go by the coordinates. I walk up there on the mesa quite a bit with my dog, and there are multiple failing, tattered, shredded plastic vinyl fencing that has been put there for prairie dog control that's been there for years. And I've actually walked it off. There's almost 1,700 linear feet of shredded fencing, varying heights of 24 inches to 40 inches. This represents 4,000 square feet of shredded plastic fencing. It's basically microplastic environmental disaster going on. If the wind blows to the east, Pleasant View soccer fields and 4 Mile subdivision will be scattered with all this microplastic. If it blows to the north, Gun Barrel will be covered. If it blows to the east, hay fields, cows, horses, sheep, and goats will be affected. But even more importantly than that, about 300 yards away is Mountain Shadow Montessori School. Hundreds of little kids out there playing in their fields. If they're outside eating something, these microplastics are going to fall in their food. And so this is really, as I said, an environmental problem. It's not something that open space is not aware of. They must be aware of it because there are sections of it that have been completely shredded that they've come and they've put an additional amount of fencing over without removing the old shredded fencing, which is still shredding. So my offer is to, if open space isn't going to take care of this, let me know. I'll take my neighbors up there and take care of this environmental disaster. And any questions, I'll answer.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Will
Next.
something be done?
We'll address any comments from the public during matters from the board. Thank you for your comments. Who's next?
Next, we have Robert Batchelder, followed by Alan Delamere, and then Bart Windrum. Robert Batchelder, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Robert Batchelder. I'm from California. My great-grandfather, William Batchelder, settled in Boulder in 1865. He homesteaded what is now Chautauqua in 1880 at age 22. He sold his farm to the Chautauqua Group and the city of Boulder in 1898. I'm also a Sand Creek soldier descendant. My second and third great-grandfathers, Granville Berkeley Jr. and Sr., settled in Boulder in 1863. Granville Berkeley Sr. was from an aristocratic background in Berkeley, Virginia. Upon settling in Boulder, he was a prominent judge, lawyer, and a U.S. cavalry captain. Fort Chambers was a hastily built fort. The Sand Creek Massacre began at Fort Chambers. My second great-grandfather, Granville Berkeley Jr., practiced maneuvers and artillery at Fort Chambers with 100 other recruits. Captain Granville Berkeley Sr., Governor John Evans, and Colonel John Chivington planned the removal of the Cheyenne tribe, which quickly became a genocide with all the hallmarks of the Holocaust. The Fort Chambers cavalry terrorized the Cheyenne tribe by firing cannons at the cottonwood trees where the Cheyenne lived at what is now East Boulder Rec Center and Hogan Pancoast, driving the starving Cheyenne to the Kansas border while promising food, supplies, safe passage, and peace. Governor John Evans and John Chivington knew Chief White Antelope, Black Kettle, and Niwot personally. Only Black Kettle survived. The massacre was textbook genocide. The philosophy of the Cheyenne and Arapaho was to always seek peace and openly promoted familial coexistence with settlers and miners, and it was working. With the elimination of the Cheyenne, Judge Granville Berkeley was able to adjudicate the theft and no return of Cheyenne to their tribal lands. White privilege, land speculation, exploitation of natural resources became the model of Granville Berkeley Sr., with the generational knowledge of the aristocratic Berkeley plantation where he was born. The soldier descendants are demanding Hogan Pancoast to honor the entire Cheyenne tribe through truth and reconciliation. The Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan requires Native participation and recognition and acknowledgement in Boulder City. There has been no Cheyenne tribal participation in Boulder City government in 162 years since the Sand Creek Massacre. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your comments, Robert.
Next is Alan Delamere, followed by Bart Windrum, and then Catherine Sundvall. Alan, you can come up to the podium.
Alan Delamere. I live at 525 Mapleton in Boulder. I've lived in that house for the last 59 years, and I've hiked all the open space over that time period. Now, in my professional career, one of the most difficult things I had to encounter when dealing with complex problems was getting good estimates. So my sympathy tonight is very much for Dan Burke, for him to get really good estimates of what fire mitigation on open space is actually going to cost is the most challenging thing of all. I distributed a little list, which I hope you have, of questions that I felt really need to be dug into. I feel that whenever we come up with the estimates, they need to be peer reviewed very carefully and make sure the basis of estimate is valid. A couple of years ago, I did a hike in the Sanitas Valley with one of Dan's senior managers, and we both had our heads down when we looked at the fire fuel problem at the bottom of the Sanitas Valley. And that was, we couldn't see what it was going to cost. I did a little experiment last year. I took two conifers on my son's property up in Fairbanks, and I followed the fire master's recommendations, trimmed the sides of them, removed all the thing. 6 hours it took for 2 trees. So I know fire mitigation is something that really needs a lot of hard on the grooves to get good estimates. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much for your comments, Alan.
Next, we have Bart Windrum, followed by Catherine Sunval, and then Elizabeth Manis. Bart, you can. Oh.
Hi, I'm Bart Windrum. I usually speak about wildfire matters, and I will briefly and then go on to another issue on my plate tonight and return to wildfire matters next month. First, I want to say thank you regarding the upcoming Shanahan Ridge Cross Boundary Wildfire Mitigation Project. And my thanks are as both personally and as the Wildfire Liaison Officer for Shanahan Ridge 5 Homeowners Association. Next, you're probably aware of Council Members Rob Kaplan's letter to the list, the hotline today, and I want to urge your wholehearted support behind what he is calling for. His 3-point call to action is a robust signage program, a very robust schedule of patrols, and expanded OS buffers. I'm here to talk about the Southern Bike Route. I live up on Shanahan Ridge along Greenbrier Boulevard. 14 years ago, 2011, during the West TSA era, it coincided with a regional effort down in Denver to complete the ring road. It would have been called W470. And if memory serves, I think the department actually bought some parcels that had something to do with preventing Highway 93 from becoming W470 interstate. At that time, the bike community clamored for a through passage. And in an op-ed that the Daily Camera published of mine, I called this throughway B470, a bike beltway. And I think the term is apt, so I'm resurrecting it now. Riders, I don't think, want a trail. They want a thoroughfare. And, they're not a marginalized group. And safe passage already exists. I have ridden the route many times. You probably know it. The underpass under Broadway, a residential road paralleling Highway 93, and the only exposure down to the Marshall Mesa trailhead is about 3/16 of a mile from the intersection of Marshall Drive and Marshall Road to the new entryway to the Marshall Mesa trailhead with a lighted signal crosswalk. So I agree with Brady, what he said several months ago in regards to hiking with his daughter. Bikes and pedestrians are incompatible. I'll go a little further than what Brady said, and I'll say the mixture destroys permanently any vestige of peace or usability for pedestrians. So a couple of things. The issue is safe crossing. We already have that existing signal, and if bikes were to use it, it probably would need a little rejiggering, beefing up perhaps. So the remaining issue is a safe return to town and that intersection of Marshall Drive and Marshall Road. I suggest two things. Secure the rights on the west side of Marshall Drive for that 3/16 of a mile to create a bike path. And then bikes have free travel. Otherwise, put a signal crossing that bikers can use at that 90-degree intersection. Lastly, I know my time is up, but thank you. Lastly, if you must consider building a trail, several things. Invest the money, even though I wish you wouldn't, to create a totally separate trail and configure it so that if there are any crossings at a pedestrian trail, they were absolutely built to require dismounting with no ability to fudge that. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Bart.
Next is Catherine Sunval, followed by Elizabeth Manis. So Catherine, yeah.
Hi, thank you for all you do. I gave you a picture of a experience I had in 2013 of visiting the Sand Creek Massacre site in Eads, Colorado. And in this picture, you see a CU Buffs cookie cutter filled with bison wool and 2 feathers. And the bison wool and the cookie cutter I had had in my car for several years in my prayer that we would do something about the Sand Creek Massacre. And I am so grateful that you purchased the Fort Chambers property so that we can acknowledge the origin of where that Sand Creek Massacre had begun, as you heard from Robert Batchelder. And the 2 feathers represent the people that were hurt in that or killed in that massacre and the horses. They murdered all the horses as well. So ever since I did this ceremony, I've been working on a Botanic Gardens project at Hogan Pancoast. And it's a Cheyenne-themed Botanic Gardens to give the experience of what it was like 200 years ago before the covered wagons came and the settlers came, so that the people of Boulder can hear the authentic stories of the Cheyenne. And when they first came to the Boulder Creek drainage, they were attracted to the cottonwoods and before their horses. And the fact that at Hogan Pancoast, it's a high water table, so it was a cottonwood bottoms back then, before all those trees were cut down to build our neighborhoods. There's Preble's jumping mouse and leopard frogs, and you have a critical habitat that's on the other side of 55th. And we're wondering if we could partner in the Botanic Gardens project with Open Space to create a corridor to have those critical species come into the Botanic Garden and expand their habitat. We're working with traditional Cheyenne chief Philip Whiteman. He spoke at the Park and Rec Advisory Board meeting, and other Northern and Southern Cheyenne tribal members, and also Robert Batchelder, who you just heard from. And here I included a poem for you to read when you have a moment about the journey that we've been on in this Botanic Gardens process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Next is Elizabeth Manis.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Manis. I live in Boulder. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I am speaking tonight because this board has an action item for the May agenda. It is titled Consideration and Recommendations regarding updates or recommendation regarding updates and changes to the open space related items in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. I am one of many people reviewing this plan, and I hope that you will delve deeply into it ahead of your next meeting. My main concern with the plan as written is the short shrift given to open space and mountain parks lands. This disregard makes me wonder, do the plan's writers have little to no knowledge about open space and mountain parks? Or have they diminished its status and purpose? Or why is open space and mountain parks so invisible? They are presented as an embarrassment, a limiting force, and a very big problem for the city of Boulder. It is alarming to me that what should be regarded as an ecological triumph, or ecological, depending on your pronunciation, is both denigrated and ignored. To me, this signals a profound misunderstanding of the role of the city and county of Boulder to guard, to protect, and to champion these spaces, spaces that should never, ever, ever be taken for granted. I do hope the board will review this important document that will guide city decision-making for the next 20 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
If you're joining online and would like to speak, you can raise your hand now. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands.
All right. If we have no other speakers, we will close public comment. And with that, we'll move on to matters from the board. I would like to start with any questions on the written material that was in the packet.
I do have a question for staff about one of the informational items, the funded research program update.
Yeah, go ahead, Morgan.
Okay, not sure who to direct this to. I appreciate the research program. I appreciate the two strategies it follows. My sense from reading the list of funded projects over the last 4 years is that they're wholly dedicated to conservation. My question for staff is, how many projects are dedicated to recreation? Are they not documented here? And is there any kind of willingness or any effort to broaden the funded projects to increase the learning laboratory approach to recreation?
Yeah, Morgan, I invite, excuse me, Brian Aneker, Senior Manager for our Science and Climate Resilience. And this program area helps to administer the funded research program. So Brian.
Hi, good evening, Morgan. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I don't know if the memo maybe didn't show clearly that we do have a commitment to recreation research. In fact, it is called for in the master plan alongside conservation. And moreover, we have our human dimension staff on our decision-making board, and they also put recreation questions out as part of our priority research projects. So I would say that's alive and well. Year over year, it can vary. I would say we do have maybe a 70-30 kind of split between conservation and recreation.
I'd love to see, I'm out of curiosity, I'm interested in what kinds of projects come through. I'd love to see that if there could be follow-up. Yeah.
Yeah, no
Okay.
problem.
Thank you, Brian.
Welcome.
Thank you, John.
All right, any other questions on the written material? If not, we could move on to any follow-ups or questions that were brought up from the public comment. Dan, I wanted to make sure you took a note on the comments about the fence at J and 63rd on the mesa there.
Yes, John, I've already reached out to staff and we'll be visiting and looking into that.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Any other board members have follow-ups or items from the public comment?
Yeah, John, I do.
Okay, go for it.
So, yeah, I usually don't do this, but a couple of members of the public brought things up that I wanted to highlight. And one was Elizabeth's comment about the comp plan. And I would just exhort you, Elizabeth, to, if there are specific passages within the comp plan that you find are really denigrating the open space purposes that we're trying to achieve here. Could you put them down in writing and help us by directing us to those passages so that we can look at them maybe in the same way you're looking at them? That'll be a good starting point for us as we think about this. And the other is relevant to Bart's comment at the end of what Bart was talking about. Bart's gone now, but I'm going to talk about what he said. And right now Casey French is in the audience, and I know she is a staff member who's working on a planning study about bicycle connectivity in the West TSA south of Greenbrier and down to potentially down to Marshall Mesa South and also South Mesa Trailhead and Dowdy Draw. And we walked that area with staff last year, and I liked what Bart said about if we're gonna do it and allow bicycles in that area, think about doing a separated plan where bikes and pedestrians don't interact. And I will say that we have two real redundant parallel trails, the Upper Big Blue Stem and the South Boulder Creek Trail. And the South Boulder Creek Trail goes through a bunch of stream environment zones and is muddy a lot of the year and goes through some area that ought to be conserved in my mind. And so, I've kind of kept myself from talking about this publicly because the study's ongoing. But I think it's a good opportunity just to highlight this for my fellow board members, that there's a nice bench just to the north of the South Boulder Creek Trail. And that bench would get a new trail out of the stream environment zones, be a better place for a bike trail than either of the existing trails. And I think it would be a nice quid pro quo to close the South Boulder Creek Trail. This is just one board member talking, my dream, and allow the environmental restoration of that sensitive trail and create a trail that is new and that is better for bikes and has better views. And also, I think by putting those two trails closer together than the two current trails are, the amount of habitat disturbance might be decreased as well. So anyway, I'm saying this based on my kind of eyeball survey of this situation, and there's going to be a lot more professional work done on this, but I wanted to get that out there.
Thanks, Harmon. Any other follow-ups from the public comment?
Yeah. Good comments from Harm about the trail. And there were a lot of great comments, and I'm going to comment on what Elizabeth said as well about the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. But that doesn't mean I didn't hear and take a lot of notes and everything else everybody said. So I just want to make that clear. I was actually going to mention this in a different part of the meeting in a few minutes, but I agree with your comments. Maybe not exactly, but yeah, directionally I agree with them. And why did I take a deeper look? Because this whole public realm tax consolidation thing made me think, in which world does this make sense? And so I looked at it again, and I've got three, just for the record. I know we're going to dive into this a little bit more, but I'd like to put out three little areas that I think could use some work in the plan. In the vision and values, I think some explicit language that open space, agricultural lands, waterways, biodiversity are foundational public assets that protect climate resilience, water resources, flood safety, ecological integrity, and the quality of life of citizens. I think that could be more explicitly mentioned. The historic narrative there's a lot of critiques in there, and a lot of them are true. And so the equity critiques, we keep that and balance it with a sentence that Boulder's open space system has delivered regionally exceptional public benefits for all residents, free of charge, which was by design to be equitable from the very beginning, and remains one of the city's most important tools for environmental protection, hazard mitigation, long-term fiscal, and land use discipline. And then the third category of my comment would be implementation funding. State clearly that environmental stewardship, open space preservation, watershed health, biodiversity, and flood resilience remain core long-term public investment priorities, not optional amenities to be traded away. And so, yeah, I think your comments are spot on. I'll be honest, we talked a lot about, what's going to happen with different open space designations, and it didn't occur to me that the very value of what we've built here in Boulder wouldn't be properly documented in this document. And in fact, I don't think it was. So I agree with that comment.
Thanks, Brady.
John, I have one item.
Sure, go for it, Morgan.
And I can't remember the individual who commented about the prairie dog fencing. And is staff
That
aware-
was
Did we
Robert
talk?
Murphy.
Was that
That was the
okay?
one
Good.
I
Sorry,
asked
on
about at the
63rd.
beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
No more things.
Brady, if no one else has any questions on the public comment or follow-ups, I think Brady had a topic you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I've actually got two. One's really quick. I just want to say, Harmon, you just stepped down from being chair, and there was very little pomp and circumstance. You've been an exceptional chair, exceptionally good, and I've learned a lot about process and anyway, there may be a day where I'm chair, maybe in a year, and I will be a much better chair after having watched you do it. And so it's obvious that this is not your first time around doing such a thing, and so I just want to say thank you.
Yes, I'll second
really
that. Thank you, Harmon.
Thank you guys. I really, that makes me feel really warm inside. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you did a great job. And occasionally had to keep me in line, which was warranted. So, okay, so the thing I did want to talk about was, so on March 12th, there was city council had a study session. And there were some draft ballot initiatives in that study session, one of which would combine the dedicated taxes for open space, parks and rec, and transportation into a so-called public realm tax. And I understand that we're in a position where there's more things to be done than we can pay for. And I think it's fair to throw all the options up on the wall and look at all the possibilities. I think that's a fair exercise. The city council did a head nod just to kind of indicate to staff what to move forward with. That particular, the public realm tax consolidation got a nod of 5-4, so it moved ahead. There was a huge public outcry. And one city council member, maybe several, said, whoa, 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 whoa. They kind of walked into a buzzsaw they didn't anticipate, and via hotline kind of basically rescinded that. So again, I think looking at all of our options is okay, but this body was not consulted in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, from what I can see, from what I observed, the entire OSMP staff were caught completely flat-footed, and were put in a position to be fielding questions from the public the very next day with no information about what had happened. And that was not true for all city departments. There were other city departments that were in the know, and this department was not. And I just think it's embarrassing, and that sort of distribution of information just doesn't engender trust or good process. So I think on a process side, we can be critical of what happened. The other thing I wanted to discuss briefly was we have been harping on the staff for a few years that we'd like more touches with the budget. We'd like to understand what's in the big black box of base, and can we take more time during the year to discuss these things? And Dan and the staff have been very responsive and have changed the process pretty significantly and outlined the newest iteration based on our feedback in February. And there was a 6-point process put in the February packet. And in the March packet, the first one of those process points was in the look ahead. We get a 3-month look ahead in every packet about what's coming up on the agenda. One of those was in there. And in the April packet, everything was gone. And my understanding is that there's a directive from the central city leadership that budget numbers are not to be shared with the public or the boards until the end of August. And I presume that the change in our look ahead budget process is a reflection of that. Okay. And so and we weren't, we weren't notified as a board about this, and potentially some of the staff have been put in a weird position. So anyway, I just think it's important to remind ourselves and city council and staff that we have a few, it's in the city charter, a few things that we have to do. We dispose of lands, open space land, we have to vote on that, and we have to recommend the city manager's budget to council as it relates to OSMP. And so I have a resolution that I'd like to read, but before I do that, I'd like to stop talking and see if anyone has any comments on what I just said. And then if it's okay with the board, I'd like to read a draft resolution that we could also discuss.
John, want to respond?
Sure. Do any of the other board members have thoughts on this before I jump in?
Yeah, I would say something.
Yeah, go for it, Harmon.
So, Dan, let me just ask you if what Brady says is true, and we're not going to have budget numbers shared with staff until late August, we wouldn't see them in a meeting until our second Wednesday in September. And then when would the budget be approved by City Council?
Yeah, so in the last few weeks in particular, city staff have been looking at developing a consistent way that all boards and commissions review the budget and bring the budget recommendations forward. Before it was a little haphazard. There's a number of boards and commissions that weigh in on budgets from their respective departments or and such. And so not everybody, there was a lot of inconsistencies. Sometimes open space, you all would see a budget in July. Sometimes the PRAB might see it in a different month. And so one of the idea was to provide that level of consistency. So the second point is beyond consistency is that you all to make a recommendation on the city manager's recommended budget, and that budget won't be released and available until mid to late August. So the ask on the consistency standpoint is that all boards and commissions use the month of September to review the city manager's budget, which will be released in late August. And so that there's a consistent sort of methodology and timing for how all boards and commissions that weigh in on things like planning board, PRAB, open space, there's a number of boards that weigh in on budgets, that would be the month of September. Then the month of October, the focus shifts to council. So council will have all the board feedback on the city manager's budget, and then the council will go into deliberations. So what that does for our cadence that we've had in the past few years and even beyond is that typically you all would look at a draft budget that typically wouldn't be the city manager's budget at that time. And that would either be in July and August. So that gets pushed back by a month or two. All of this is in development in terms of what would that new cadence look like for the staff to bring forward information to you all. And quite frankly, that's a work in progress. We know that the review and recommendation from this board would happen in September. What information would be available before that? What's that look like? What are those touches? That's what I am trying to understand better, and we'll come back probably in May and give you a fresh look at what a new cadence could look like.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that draft budgets that are from intra-departmental draft budgets, ones that come from individual departments to their boards, we could still have touches before our September meeting when we're looking at the actual budget that you're going to present to city council that is the manager's budget.
We likely would not be bringing forward you draft versions of the budget. We would be bringing you the city manager's budget.
So just one touch, just September?
Well, that's what John and I have been discussing, and others is fully realizing that one touch may be inadequate. That's what we're looking at. Of possibly scheduling a later September OSBT special meeting. And so to allow you that dual touch that you used to before you move into, so looking at the full budget, you usually would have a month to go look at that, and then you would move into public hearing and the deliberations at a following meeting rather than trying to do that all at once. And that's the nuances that we're trying to build out to allow you to have that dual look, if you will.
Okay, so my take on this, Brady and Morgan and John, is that it's kind of a dumb one size fits all approach. That's going to mean an extra meeting for us and a real compressed review calendar. Not all boards really control or have any say so in the budget. I spent 5 years on planning board. I don't remember a budget conversation once because the budget of the planning department and the engineering department is staff salaries. We aren't managing, in the planning department, they're not managing 46,000 acres worth of land and countless programs for the public and stuff. So all boards are not created equal. The Arts Commission's not looking at a budget like what we're looking at. And a board's responsibility to understand its department's budget and weigh in on that budget is different from board to board. And so it seems to me like if the city were thinking properly, and this is my judgment, the city's not thinking properly, that what the city would do is while they're developing their budget for this department, the city manager would invite us into that conversation since we have to review it. And we'd get to see it in July and August, and we'd be part of that conversation rather than them saying, well, we'll give this thing to you in whole cloth, and then you got to scramble and figure out, what your priorities are. That just absolutely turns our advisory role and our recommendatory role on its head in a way that doesn't make any sense to me. And this idea of creating some sort of baseline where every board sees the budget at the same time just doesn't reflect the reality of what boards do in this city.
A couple of things that if I could respond to. Planning board actually does review and make a recommendation. Their purview is the CIP portion of the city budget. So they definitely do deliberate on CIP and make a recommendation. So just a clarification.
No, you're right. And I mean,
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah.
That's true. But that's, one specific bucket of money for projects. We have a CIP in open space amid a whole raft of other funds that we're looking at. But thanks for pointing
Sure.
that out.
And the other thing I would point out, and this is, so pros and cons of this approach, right? Cons, compressed, feeling like you don't have enough time. I'm hoping that we can address that in some form or fashion. Sort of the benefits in terms of you all will be actually seeing the city manager's recommended budget. Typically, in the years past, we would bring you a draft version, and then we would go to executive budget team. There'd be a lot of deliberations looking at it, and our budget from what staff was bringing forward would change, sometimes pretty significantly. And you have already made your touch and your recommendation on those things minus the final version. So one positive I see on it is you are now seeing sort of the final deliberations of staff, and in prior years, you would be seeing a version and then got changed and not really having a meeting to be able to discuss what those changes were. So I'll just point that there's a benefit there.
Some pros and cons. Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Morgan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, thank you, John. I'm 1 hour into my first meeting. I agree with what you shared, Brady. Harmon, also, I agree that I served 5 years on the Environmental Advisory Board. We had no purview on the budget and served in a much different advisory capacity. I find it disappointing to understand that we'll have fewer than a month to review and recommend the budget. And in addition to what you shared, the lack of transparency is alarming. When we're not served the due process, I think it creates concern for us. I'm hearing that. And then it's not fair to people who deeply care about these issues either. And transparency, I think, is a value we should advance in addition to following our obligations. And I understand you might have other items to share.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks,
you, John.
Morgan. In terms of my thoughts on this, we've been moving towards a more and more transparent and, kind of drawn out budget process. And this is a really extreme move in the opposite direction, away from transparency. And in terms of giving us time to do, one of our two statutory duties as a board, in terms of reviewing the budget. I don't feel like I can adequately, absorb and, ask all the questions I need to as a board member in a matter of a month that we've historically had time to do. And I think, as volunteers serving on a board, you know, it's a lot more to ask of us to do that in a month and dive into a budget as large as the open spaces budget and do the diligence that we're expected to do for the community on behalf of the community to review the budget. So um, I'm I'm equally concerned and kind of aligned with all three of you, um, and would love to see and hear more of what's in your head in terms of a resolution, Brady.
Thanks. Thanks, John. Yeah, one quick comment. Dan mentioned that one of the benefits is that we'll be seeing the city manager's budget and not the OSMP budget. I think in the past, my understanding is that the OSMP budget was very similar to the city manager's budget because staff made recommendations and not a whole lot changed. And I think that's changed over the last few years. And I would just say, in light of the cost allocation discussions, which was not transparent at all last year, and frankly is a pittance compared to the thought of all of our dedicated funds going away. And then this public realm kind of surprise. I think it's totally fair for us to cry foul and to ask for something specific. So, Leah,
Yeah.
could you put the draft resolution up for everybody to look at, and I'll read it out loud.
While she pulls that up, I'll add, I think there's a lot of value in us seeing what the difference is between staff's budget and the city manager's budget is. It helps give us perspective as well. So I
Yeah, that's
think,
a great comment, John. I agree. So here's the draft resolution for the reconsideration of the board. Be it resolved that the Open Space Board of Trustees formally expresses concern that the current city budget development timeline does not provide sufficient time for the board to meaningfully fulfill its charter responsibility to review and recommend the OSMP budget. The current schedule is a significant departure from past practice and from the 6 milestone timeline staff presented to the board on February 11th, 2026. The board needs timely information on the overall budget picture, including revenue expense trends, major programmatic shifts, significant departures from prior practice or assumptions, and broader funding proposals such as the recent public realm tax consolidation proposal on which the board had no opportunity to advise. This context is essential to allow the board to provide meaningful guidance on major changes affecting OSMP revenue and expenses, including shifts in responsibility for costs. The board requests that council direct staff to restore a more iterative budget review process, including providing budget context, trends, assumptions, and major issues for discussion by early summer, even if a complete draft budget is not yet available. Adequate time and information are essential to maintaining the integrity, intent of the board's advisory role.
I move that the board adopt the resolution that's on the screen as drafted.
I'll second it.
Yeah, any discussion? Morgan, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I would like, and not an interpretation so much as just a discussion at a meeting around, and maybe a presentation from staff on the potential, this public realm tax and the implications for the OSMP budget. And if that's a tax that goes to the ballot, passes very hypothetically in November, what the potential implications are. And I'm not interested in real deep discussion on hypotheticals, but as we review the budget, we need to look at what's ahead and not just right in front of our faces too. So Brady, I say that I'm not sure we need to amend this. I think it's covered under trends, assumptions, major issues for discussion. But I'd like to share that that's not something we can react to. I want to try and plan for it to the extent we can react to after the fact.
And I'll jump on that train just a little bit. If we were to amend this, I would think one of the things that we could amend, which Morgan points out, is around the public realm tax, which may just, since it's not going to happen, be sort of a little poke in council's eye saying, you didn't tell us about this. And if what we're really asking for is just that we get more budget transparency on the actual budget, I could see taking that clause out of the resolution unless you want to poke council in the eye, which they might deserve.
It's not meant to be a poke in the eye. It's meant to be an example of the sorts of things that we would like to be consulted on.
Mhm,
I mean, I don't know, and you've got a closer reading of the charter, Harmon, than I do. I don't know if them coming to us with something as big as getting rid of all of our dedicated funds is something that the charter requires by the letter. It's certainly by the spirit would. And if what we're trying to do is engender trust, transparency, and a collaborative process, good governance, allowing the public to weigh in and talk to us about things over a reasonable period of time, then that is exhibit A in the sorts of things we'd like to avoid in the future. So
Yeah.
I would like to keep it in.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to leave it in.
Okay. One thing I would say is I think John's comment about like, hey, it's actually kind of good to see a staff budget, and if there's some tension between what happened with this with the city budget, the city manager's budget that ultimately comes out. I mean, this is not explicit about that, and kind of gives the city a little bit of an out, saying even if a complete draft budget is not yet available. I don't know if anyone on the board would like to change that, or if you're still happy with it as drafted.
Yeah, I'm still happy with it as drafted. Unless anyone has suggestions on how to add that in. Um, I'll echo what Harmon said. I think, I would be comfortable removing the bit about the public realm tax in order to keep it more focused just around the budget, but also happy to leave it in.
John, may I?
Yes.
I'd like to leave it in. I think we need to be responsive to things that are considered when budgeting for programs and staff and everything else that goes into the budget. I think it's a timely example, and it's it could be a real implication to this department in the budget.
Yeah, well, that last comment, I mean, if it had gone through, our budget would have gone down significantly.
Yep.
That's the only, we would have gone from a, 36-ish million operating expenses to Lord knows what, maybe 20 something or worse, so I mean, it would have had a huge budget implication.
But it was a mechanism to solve a problem, and that problem hasn't gone away. So something else might come up, and
That's
I think this is a timely example.
Okay, so there's a motion to accept it.
Okay.
In a second. I have nothing else to add, John.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I'm on board with this. Uh, I think the lack of transparency here has been alarming. Like the city comes to us when they're talking about changing parking fees around Chautauqua years in advance. And to not come and talk to us and bring daylight to changes like this around the budget or potential funding mechanisms in general for the open space department is pretty alarming. So why don't we put it to a vote? Do a roll call here. Morgan,
In favor.
Harmon,
Aye.
Brady,
Aye.
and I will vote yes as well. All right. Um, any other topics and matters from the board before we move on? All right, hearing none. Dan, I'll hand it over to you for matters from the department.
Yeah, thank you, John. So we have three different matters to bring forward to you tonight. One is our April, Morgan, typically in April, it's Volunteer Appreciation Month. So we typically like to highlight our volunteer program, enter into record a proclamation, and to actually call out and highlight the service of a few volunteers. And so we're going to start off with that item tonight, and I'm going to invite Debbie Cushman, who's our volunteerism and service learning program manager, to kind of kick this celebration off.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Good evening, board and public and volunteers. Thank you, amazing volunteers, for being with us tonight. I have sent the board a full memo with an attachment to our report. It's just a 4-page report. It's small. So I hope you've had the chance to read that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our program. So again, I'm Debbie Cushman. As Dan mentioned, I'm one of 2 of our volunteerism and service learning managers at Open Space. And next slide. Good. These are our participation trends with the with volunteerism and over quite a long period of time on here. But in 2025, we had over 1,500 volunteers who gave over 17,000 hours of their time, which is really phenomenal. This is following a trend that we've had for the last couple of years. And since COVID, we are feeling really good about these numbers. We are still meeting all the needs of our staff in the volunteer needs they have, as well as meeting our community needs and their expectations of what we provide for them to get involved with. Next slide. I broke down a couple little pie charts in really bright colors. On the left, you can see all of our programs. So we have the ongoing volunteer program is on the left on the big pie chart in teal blue, and that's the program I manage. So that's about 40% of our volunteer and service learning hours. To the right of that in the light blue is our one-day volunteer projects. Those are things like trail building, some of our climate action projects. And then the top two slices of the pie in orange, our Bridge House Ready to Work crew. That's a contract crew that we have a partnership with. They're an adult crew. They are experiencing homelessness and they come to learn job skills with us on open space. And then the last slice of the pie, our green slice over there, is our Junior Ranger program, which is another service learning program. It's our youth that we hire every summer to come work with us on service learning projects. They're also paid. I can broke down the one-day projects. That light blue slice is broken down into that other pie on the right. So you can see all the one-day programs happening. The big red slice there at the top is our trail program. So Anna Daves and Bo Clark run that program. They have their Tuesday and Wednesday volunteer days. Volunteers can come out and join them. They also do National Trails Days. They work with Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance. Lots of trail work going on. Our purple slice is our Trailheads program. So Dave Barry has scouts helping him on Trailheads projects. So often things like maintenance in parking lot areas, the public bathroom areas with scouts, and some court-ordered volunteerism as well. And then the little green slice over there on the right is our climate action projects that are run by Chris Weinberger and her one-day team. So things like forest management projects, native seed collections, all good, amazing things going on. Next slide. I broke down some of the programs I manage for you because I manage a lot of programs for open space, including the board. And so you can see about 2/3 of the programs all the way from that big teal blue slice, which are our trail ambassadors. So our folks hiking out on the trails, talking to the public about safety, trail direction, dog regulations, all sorts of fun thing, all the way through to the bottom area of a kind of a green slice over there are all our public facing volunteers. So presence on the land, they're all uniformed volunteers talking to the public. And then you can see so many other programs we're doing. Our Bat and Raptor Monitor programs are two of our bigger hours spent, as well as our education naturalists. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about them later in the program. And then, of course, the board, you have a slice of pie up there as well. So thank you for your volunteerism. Next slide. Just to give you a teeny little budget numbers here, the impact for our volunteer and service learning team this year, or 2025, was $638,000, which is equivalent to about 8 full-time staff. And that comprises the 2 full-time volunteer service learning folks, our temporary crew leads, and then all the other staff that we work with who contribute to the volunteer programs. Our budget was about $320,000 between salaries and supplies. So you can see our return on investment. It's about $1.99. So thank you, volunteers, for being our force multiplier in getting our work done on open space. Next slide. So some of the other items I wanted to bring up that we do besides manage all our volunteers, our whole department is involved in the volunteer cooperative. If you haven't heard of the volunteer cooperative, it's our citywide effort to bring all the volunteer managers in the city together. So we work with all the other departments, transportation, parks and rec. We still work with our city library system volunteers. And we all sit on different committees to get work done that's beneficial to all our teams. So these are some of the committees we sit on. Our Volunteer Appreciation Committee does just that. We invite you to fun events out at the reservoir. There's a picture in the top right of that. We do little one-day events here and there, like tours of some of our city buildings and pottery classes and fun ways to say thank you to our volunteers. Our staff training committee, I sit on that committee. That was a big lift in 2025 for me. So for a couple years, we've been working on training the staff in the city who don't do volunteerism as a full-time job, but do it as part of their job. So we've designed a 3-hour training. The volunteer cooperative staff, Cassie, myself, and the library staff, and we now offer training. So it took us all of 2025. We really developed that, and we had 2 very successful trainings with 25 other managers throughout the city in January and February of this year, and we'll continue those. The Emergency Response Committee, I sit on that as well. I work a little bit at the Office of Disaster Management when there are fires, floods, and all of that fun stuff in the city. Inclusion and Belonging, as it sounds, Chris is on that committee. Our Creek Cleanup Committee was a committee we formed this year to address the issue between Parks and Rec and open space of safely inviting the community to do creek cleanups. The community wants to do that work, and it can be very dangerous sometimes. So we formed a quick action committee, and that committee actually won a service value award from the city this year. So very proud of that. And then finally, our Give Pulse committee. That Give Pulse is the database I ask you to enter your hours in, and all other volunteers enter their hours in the city. And that was a big lift. We have a new system. We spent a lot of time in 2025 getting that up and running, but we're there. Next slide. So we have a ton of work that happens behind the scenes when we bring volunteers onto open space. All volunteers go through an orientation, some training for their job. If it's a one-day program or trail project, they might just do it right there with the staff out in the field. Volunteers I manage, however, are usually independently out and go through quite a bit of training, anywhere from about 4 hours maybe for your job to about 20 hours for most of our volunteers. And then our education naturalists more than that. But just a couple fun pictures of what we do during training, whether it's in a classroom, out in the field. I actually have a volunteer in the middle top picture who's helping us lead one of our trainings for our other trail ambassadors. We get together with the staff and make sure they do team building with volunteers who work directly with them. The middle bottom picture is, I think that's me testing the dogs from our dog ambassador program. So those are the only dogs on open space we actually give a test to, are our volunteers who hike with their dogs and model dog behavior. And lastly, ongoing volunteer training. For example, when we had burrowing owls last year out at Gun Barrel Hill, the circle picture is me and Jesse from our outreach team. And we're training some of our volunteers who regularly hike out there and talk to the public and ride their bikes out at Gun Barrel Hill to let them know about the rules, the regs around the burrowing owl closures. Next slide. So our education naturalists, these are all pictures that actually just happened a couple weeks ago. But every other year we bring on a group of education naturalists. We have 40 of them right now at Open Space. We have our 8 new ones. And these volunteers go through more training. They go through about 80 hours of training and then about another additional 20 shadowing and getting ready to teach programs. So we are tasking them with teaching our young folks about wildlife, about the ecosystem, about the weather, about safety. So we have a lot of fun. I hope you can see the fun happening in these pictures, but we do have a lot of fun doing it. We also train the rangers with us. So that bottom picture shows our 8 new crew plus volunteers plus some of the open space and urban rangers who we also trained to do this work. They go through a 4-day training called Certified Interpretive Guide training through the National Association of Interpretation. So a lot more effort going in here. Next slide, please. And with that, I am going to recognize two of our education naturalists who are here tonight. And they are going to come up to the podium and just talk for a few minutes about what they do, why they do it. And you are welcome to ask them questions while they're up here. So Linda Gerstel and Cheryl Gray, if you want to come join me. And thank you, education team, for being here with us to support us tonight, too.
Yep, thank you. So hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you tonight. My name is Linda Gerstel, and I am a happy volunteer naturalist. I was trained in 2019. So I came into this as a retired teacher and also just someone who enjoyed the trails, running and hiking on the trails. But I wanted to do a little bit more. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to share my passion for open space with other people. So I dove into this work. And in these years, I have to say, it's been so much more. It has been one of the best things I've ever done. It has given me this great satisfaction and really joy in sharing our wild places with children and with adults in our community. So it's been wonderful work for me. So in the spring and in the fall, I help with field trips. They're preschool through mostly 8th grade with occasional high school field trips. And we lead programs on all types of ecology, plant ecology and wildlife, grassland, wetland, forest ecology. Also, as Deb said, safety in the outdoors. But we also do connection to nature and belonging in nature and some sensory type programs. So it's pretty comprehensive. In the summer, I help with some junior ranger training. The junior rangers, as well as working on the trails, there's an education component. So I help with that, and I do some botanical illustration programs with them a few times during the summer. I also help with, or not help with, I work with older adults teaching botanical illustration. That's just a personal interest of mine, which I've now used as a volunteer. So I work both outdoors in the summer with older adults, and I work year round doing indoor art classes for older adults, which is held in conjunction with the Age Well centers. So I teach all types of botanical illustration at the West Age Well Center and also at the East Age Well Center. And my goal in doing these art classes is really to help the older adults in our community to connect with nature. And many are still out there hiking on the trails, but some have limited mobility. They're missing their time in the outdoors. And I feel like one of my main goals is helping older adults connect with nature through art and learning to observe, learning to see the natural world, and to express themselves through art. So it's something that I enjoy very much. And also I teach in the winter wildlife program in the summer, or in the winter from January through about now, April. We do 3rd grade wildlife programs indoors in the classrooms. So we go to the schools and we teach black bear, mountain lion, coyote, and snake programs to most 3rd graders in Boulder. I help a little bit with forest bathing. I just work with another naturalist, assisting her in a couple forest bathing programs a year. And also with another naturalist, I do a White Rocks family program out at White Rocks. So I have to acknowledge our staff who it gives us as naturalists tremendous support in everything from materials, props, help with logistics. They're always there and will do anything to help us be successful. So I'm grateful to them for making this work possible. They also provide social events and friendship. And I have to also say that this work has given me something I didn't expect, which has been lasting friendships with other volunteers and with staff that I truly treasure. So that's a little bit about what I do as a volunteer naturalist. So thank you for the opportunity to do the work and to speak with you tonight. Thanks.
Thanks for coming, Linda. It doesn't sound like you're retired.
So my name is Cheryl Gray, and I'm also a naturalist who was just trained 2 years ago. I moved here in 2020 from Washington, D.C., had a job very much like what you all are doing now, I must say, and this is a totally different world for me. I'm not a teacher. I have 3 kids, and I love children, and I absolutely love the natural world, and we always come to Colorado our whole life and hiked in the mountains. So I came and I said, this is wonderful. I heard about this program. This is how I want to spend my time here in Boulder. Of course, COVID hit and there was no training for 3 years. So I had to wait for 2024. They had to skip an entire training 2-year session. But in the meantime, twice I hiked every hike in the OSMP system, every trail, so, and got 2 pins. So I must say, I love your system. I cannot believe how wonderful OSMP is. I have to tell you, I worked internationally. I have never been to a city in the entire world that has the system that we have here and the people we have. And it is remarkable. And if people don't understand what a gift this is, I want to tell them because it is truly remarkable. And I'm taking as much advantage as I can of it. Anyway, Linda talked a lot about the programs. We had about 60 hours of training, a lot of training on process and how you deal with children, as well as substance. But of course, we learn a lot of the substance ourselves on our own. We're reading things constantly in books and going on Wikipedia and discovering new things. Because I always say you don't really learn it till you have to teach it. And the staff throws things in your lap, which is kind of incredible. After this training, they say, okay, come, you have 3 hours with, 15 fourth graders at Wonderland Lake. And you really have to come up with the plan, with the content, the delivery. They give all the support they can, but they say it's your program. Every teacher's program is different. I love geology, and I always ask the students, why are the mountains here? And we go through a lot of thinking about the history of the earth and how many billions of years it is. I'm trying to give them a slight kernel of inspiration at just how long this world has been here and how these mountains are here and how many different environments have been where we're standing, and just a little inkling of inspiration as well as a lot of fun. And the people, the coordinators who have taught us a lot of different ways that the kids can have fun, and they really do have fun. But I probably do about 10 to 15 programs a year at least. Many of them being these 3-hour programs, which takes a ton of organization and planning. And working with the other naturalists, as Linda said, we've really become good friends, and we're often delivering these things together. And then she mentioned the Winter Wildlife Program, where you learn a whole lot about coyotes and bears and mountain lions and rattlesnakes. And so I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I think not only is OSMP amazing, but the kids who live here in Boulder or Boulder Valley School District are getting unbelievable access to nature that I think most kids just don't have. I just came actually from a program we just gave at NCAR this afternoon to a Girl Scout troop. And I focused a lot on geology and the ecosystem of Ponderosa pine forest. They had a blast. They had fun. Even the chaperones were playing the games with us. So, it's just a great program. And as Debbie said, there's a huge number of hours that Boulder is getting free from volunteers. But to us, it's a tremendous benefit as well. So thank you all very much.
Awesome. And I didn't mention this, but we educated 3,000 students this year with the help of our volunteer team. Staff helps a little bit there too, but I'd say about 2,000 of those hours are volunteer hours educating our students of Boulder. So Next and the last slide, second to last slide. John, do you want to read the declaration for National Volunteer Week for us?
Sure, I'd be happy
Awesome.
to. So the Open Space Board of Trustees joins the staff of the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks Department in recognizing all our volunteers during National Volunteer Week 2026. We salute the hundreds of open space and mountain parks volunteers who contributed their talents and efforts in helping the department carry out its city charter purpose for open space. This community of volunteers is an inspiration as their contributions help to protect the resources and provide for enjoyable experiences, making Boulder's open space and mountain parks a special place.
Thank you. And thank you, volunteers. Yay. Pass it on. Next slide, Leah. Lastly, of course, I have questions for the board. While you're reading those, I just want to tell you about these fun last 3 pictures because they were just highlights from this year from our program. The picture on the left is our program with Rocky Mountain Equality and an esoteric culinary garden. And we work with middle school LGBT kiddos on that program. They learn how to grow, they learn about farming, they learn about pollinators, and they also learn about preservation of agricultural lands and open space. So really cool program Chris Weinberger's running. The middle picture is our dog ambassadors. We started doing some dog watering stations out on the Bluebell Road. Really selfishly, Christian and I were trying to recruit dog ambassadors, but it turned into something the community was pretty psyched about because we were hauling water up there but at the same time educating about dog safety in the heat. And the picture on the far right is a new program this year. It's me and Christian Driver from our cultural resource department out on the land, and we have 6 new volunteers. They already are part of the Indian Peaks Archaeological Society, and we are training them how to monitor for our cultural resources and hence to protect them out on the land. So another exciting program that we started this year. And I'm open to any questions you have. Natasha Steinman is with me as well, my supervisor, and anything we can answer for you all or any opportunities you want to come join us on this year. You know where to find me all, and I will set those up for you, of course.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Debbie. Really appreciate it and appreciate you, reminding us to put our hours in the system every
Yes.
few months. I definitely need the
Thanks,
reminder and
John.
always appreciate the nudge when that comes through. And I'm just love hearing about the dog ambassador program. I've been on the road traveling for work and I really miss my dog. So
Oh,
I'm just
yeah.
I appreciate the dog pictures.
Great.
Um, you mentioned, some of the volunteers were paid, some weren't. Are like the Bridge House folks paid? And I think you mentioned the junior
Yeah.
rangers are paid.
Yeah. we consider them service learning opportunities. So yes, they are paid. The ready to work folks are paid through a contract. And then we pay as city employees, our junior ranger staff, young staff in the summertime.
Yeah.
So that differentiates them a little from volunteers.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I was just curious about that. Do any of the other board members have questions?
May I, John?
Yes, go for it.
600,000, or Debbie, thank you, and
You're
Cheryl and
welcome.
Linda. And I get emotional when I think about just the investment that you and everyone in your programming is making in stewardship too, and building connections within the volunteers and modeling volunteering to our community. I mean, the list of benefits is endless. And what a tremendous investment in people and community in our city, and really wonderful ways to connect. And just I'm floored by 600,000 hours. So pausing on that number to reflect on the time and effort and care you put into building that. And it's just tremendous.
Awesome.
So thank you. I would love to join as time
Yes.
allows and
Yes.
just be part of your wonderful programming and work. And I don't have questions.
You can come
Yeah.
out and bat monitor with me one
I
night.
used to be
How
a bat
about
monitor.
since
Yeah.
you used to be a bat
I
monitor,
saw you don't have
Morgan?
prairie dog monitoring there anymore. That
No, we
wasn't
don't
on your
have
list.
that right
No,
now.
that's
Come
I
bat
did that
monitor.
too. Yeah.
Or you can come raptor monitor.
So thank you
Yeah.
to you and everyone in within the program and department. Yep.
Thanks.
I just want to explicitly thank Linda and Cheryl for coming in and volunteering all those hours. And I'd love to take one of your classes sometime. Honestly, I'm sure I would learn a lot. It's just the caliber of our volunteers is pretty mind blowing. So thanks for highlighting that. Debbie, good. Well done. Good presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great presentation, and thanks for all the great energy that you bring, Debbie and Natasha, and your team. It's a wonderful program, and as Morgan said, the number of hours is really mind-boggling, and the contributions that it makes to our community in all those different areas. The funnest part for me was looking at all the different categories of service around that big pie chart and seeing
Oh, good. I
how
thought
many
I
things the
was
volunteers
boring
do.
y'all with that.
Sorry?
I was worried I was boring you all
No,
with
no,
pie
I love,
charts.
I was just reading around the 360 degrees of it, thinking we do that, and we do that, we do that. It's fantastic. So the last time, Linda, I saw you, I was out hiking around on the county open space at Patasso with my son, and you were out with John and George, and you captivated us for a few minutes, demystifying some of the flowers. We were trying to figure out what they were. And so, Cheryl, I hope we bump into you. I'm a big fan of geology, and you can captivate us too one of these days out on the trails. Thank you, guys.
Last comment for me is I appreciate also that you put budget numbers in there. And
For
just-
you, Brady.
well, for all of us, I hope, Debbie, but I see that, and it really brings home the value that what you and your volunteers are driving. So thanks for including that.
I do have a question, Debbie. Sorry. Hearing the public comment and just I know the depth of people here, but also volunteers working to connect people with wildfire management and mitigation resources. I can't remember exactly from your pie chart, but how can we, and not a topic for today, kind of putting a pin in it, but I see a big opportunity to connect people with the work that OSMP is doing to keep themselves and their property and their neighbors safe. Any thoughts on that, or help me understand kind of what the connection is there?
Yeah, the one thing I can speak to, our Ready to Work crew does a lot of the mowing for the WUI project. So that's a big piece of the management side. Open to ideas, yes, of how we do more of the education side maybe and some of
Seems
the
like
other
a big
pieces.
opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I'll also add that in that pie chart that Debbie was showing of the ODVP, the one-day volunteer projects, there's that slice, it's about 20% of it, of our VSL sponsored projects. Those are the ones that Chris Weinberger and her team lead. Those are all climate action focused. So they're not all specifically fire, but they're all climate action focused. And a lot of them are with our forestry team. And a big component of that is education around fire prevention and home safety, just kind of like all the work that OSMP is doing on the wildland urban interface. So we're starting to do that, but it's also a tricky thing, right? Like there's a lot of expectation for OSMP to do that work. And so we have to be careful how we involve volunteers, but we are trying. Yeah.
I understand that. Thank you. I like I said, I think there's opportunity and tremendous community interest in helping. So
Absolutely. And I want to just ask, I'm just going to answer a question, even though Sarah's not here, that I know she would ask and that she's asked before in the past. We just wanted to follow up, which is we've worked really hard this year to offer more youth and families volunteer opportunities. So we're excited to have quite a few of those. So if anybody else on the board or if Sarah wants to know what those are, I'm happy to share those out. But we have some with the South Teller Trailhead for family and kids. It's combining nature play and education with weeding and taking care of a pollinator garden. We have some open to the community opportunities with Lightroot Community Farm and doing some like caretaking there. There's some that are specifically for teenagers only, but then there's some that are teens and families with any age kids. And then, of course, we also have our Junior Rangers, which has a lot more capacity this year, and they've done a great job offering public events as well, not just the Junior Ranger program. So they have some family-friendly programs as well. So, yeah, thanks.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate that. Thanks for coming in to talk with us. Thank you so much. And Morgan, I agree. I would love to explore with staff so how we can expand the volunteerism aspect. We do a lot of education and outreach on fire, why fire, how it's ecologically benefit, as well as trying to minimize and mitigate wildfire risk. On the education side of things, the volunteerism side of things, I think would be a very ripe thing to continue to explore. I look forward to doing that with our staff. All right, we're going to be moving on, John, to our second topic tonight. We had a couple of people speak on public comment about our Fort Chambers Poor Farm project. This has been in front of you for a number of years, and we are moving along on one slice of that project, which is the site plan aspect that calls for an interpretive trail. And that is a project that we are continuing to have very engaged conversations and involvement with our Arapaho and Cheyenne partners, tribal representatives, as well as the community. So tonight's focus is bringing you on that path of how the development of the interpretive trail is going. And so I'm going to turn things over to Casey French, who is our Senior Manager of Planning and Design Work Group.
Thanks, Dan. I am still pulling up the presentation. Just give me one quick
second. Oh, great. And
here.
Also joining us is we have hired Studio Tectonic, and Seth is here from that firm. They are, their expertise is helping to work on projects like the Healing Trail. And we are getting a lot of value from their expertise on interpretation, and education elements that we have heard from a thematic standpoint of what we should emphasize. And they're helping to put those ideas and concepts into actually on the ground kind of thing. So look forward to, Seth, your participation tonight as well.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, Seth Frankel, and also a Boulderite.
Well, thanks for the introductions, Dan. As Dan mentioned, Casey French, Planning Senior Manager with Open Space in Mountain Parks. Morgan, nice to meet you. So tonight's presentation, we are going to be focused on hearing the board's thoughts on the interpretive messaging and the conceptual designs. I will do also just a very brief recap, but for discussion, I have put up some questions. I'll put them up at the end of the screen, but just thought I would share them at the beginning. So as you're going through the presentation, you might provoke some thoughts. So as a recap, in collaboration with our tribal representatives, from 2021 to 2024, we developed a concept plan for the Fort Chambers Poor Farm site, which it was based on the vision, heal the land, heal the people. And the plan called for actions related to preserving agricultural, enhancing natural ecosystems, and supporting visitors with an interpretive experience along a healing trail. And so in 2025, we began a subsequent planning process focused solely on the design and the experience along the interpretive trail. And we've been following a 5-step process for this design. We've had community engagement windows at all the steps along the way. And as Dan mentioned, we've been continuing our collaboration with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes along this time frame too. So previously, you might remember we broke down the trail into these 5 areas, and this is just as a design tool. And to also guide decisions about design, interpretation, and programming across these areas, a central interpretive idea was developed. And so this central interpretive idea, or what we're calling the big idea, it's the backbone of the interpretive messaging. It explains why this place matters today. It explained not only what happened, but why those events continue to matter. And so on the screen, I have the simplified, which is the shortest version of the big idea. And as with everything that we're going to present tonight, there are longer versions and more details that were in attachment A, which is the full interpretive plan. But I think it's really important for this to settle in. So I'm just going to take a moment and read this big idea. In the early 1860s, settlers in the Boulder Valley built Fort Chambers, not in response to attack, but from fear and hatred of indigenous presence on their ancestral lands. That fear, interwoven with political ambition, economic pressure, racial ideology, and the instability of wartime governance, became policy and violence, leading to the Sand Creek Massacre. Though the fort vanished, the beliefs that built it endured. This site invites reflection on how fear shaped action, memory, and responsibility. And so we use this big idea to help us organize and explore how many related topics could be woven into the on-site interpretation. And so these topics might look familiar to you. They were what we heard was what was important from previous engagement windows. And so the degree of fill in each bar indicates the relative level to which a topic is physically represented within the area. And another way to look at the interpretive messaging or themes across the site is to look at these simplified learning objectives that were developed for each of the 5 areas. And these are what we hope the visitor will experience in each area in the most distilled or simplified form. So for the rival area, we will introduce the history of the site and orient visitors to what they will experience. And so here I've highlighted the learning objectives, and here again are a couple prominent themes along with a short narrative. This site is situated within a continuum of Indigenous precedents, forced removal, and resilience. And moving into the decompression area, this is the threshold of the site where visitors kind of change from an everyday pace, kind of slow down a little bit, and we'll invite visitors to hear the voices of the land and the people of the Boulder Valley and cultivate an awareness that the land was actively lived in and shaped long before Western settlement, and that during westward expansion, ecological and social change was really rapid and uncertain. And so in this decompression area, we've shared a design concepts that were called the paired voices. And this contains a series of nodes along the trail, acting as a kind of gateway and sharing both settler and tribal contexts and perspectives with interpretive signs or quotes, supporting history or other visuals. And so for the settler perspectives, there is a door frame, a post referencing fort posts, and there are growing layers of sod reflective of increased settler presence. And the use of the faux sod is also meant to serve as a sort of artistic representation of the fort. And for the tribal perspectives, we have poles referring to Native American structures and ingenuity. And then the reducing quantity of poles are suggestive of the reduced Indigenous presence concurrent with the increased settler presence. And the interpretive messaging for this paired voices concept includes the settler perspective of changing the land paired with the tribal perspective of living with the land, arrival and claim, movement and belonging, who is arriving paired with who lives here, betrayals and promises, and then feeling change and seeing change. And so just diving into one example here, there would be brief quotations or reflections that kind of prompt momentary exploration rather than extended reading. And I want to emphasize that these quotes here are just examples. We've yet to select the quotes, but we have heard from the tribes that some quotes are powerful and something to explore. And so now I'm going to be moving into the discovery area. And this is where we are proposing to reinterpret the marker and question how history is remembered. So we'll share settler hardships in Boulder were accompanied by anxiety, rumors, and a call for removal of tribes, and how this led to the hasty construction of Fort Chambers. And we'll invite visitors to examine how fear became mobilization and understand Boulder's direct role in Company D and Sand Creek. So the discovery area includes the final sod signage, which kind of marks the arrival at the discovery area. It includes a tactile map of Fort Chambers. There's a set of interpretive kiosks focusing on settlement and escalation, fear and fort construction, and violence and memory. We have additional interpretive elements that would focus on present-day perspectives, reinterpretation, or accountability. And then we have the reinterpreted stone marker. We also have Indigenous plantings and a seeding gathering area. So we have 4 different draft concept designs, and I just want to highlight that they all contain these elements, but the concepts differ in arrangement and form. And I'm going to have Seth go through these 4 designs for us.
Thanks, Casey. You'll see in design concept number 1, and the 4 of them, as Casey mentioned, do hearken on all of the same thematic elements that we're trying to convey, but in different kinds of ways and expressions. There's not one right answer to this, and in fact, of these 4 designs, there are even aspects of it that might transfer very well into each other. We present 4 different concepts here to be able to allow them to express themselves and allow for the storyline to unfold in different ways, and you'll see how that unfolds through the different methodologies. You can see in design concept number 1 here, the angled marker, there's an element which is a tactile map of the fort itself. The only known documentation of the fort in terms of how it physically looked is through one recollection sketch. There isn't evidence that shows what this fort physically looked like in a concrete kind of way, and so we want to be able to show this, and in fact, its location is not precisely known even within this location, though this particular area is in all likelihood within a stone's throw, if you will, of the location. You can see the interpretive wall in this particular location where we have different kinds of interpretive material that is in fact acting as almost as a shield or a reveal. This is difficult content. This is content that we want to be able to allow the public to approach and allow them to discover it in their own way. In this particular version, you can see there's sort of a protective wall which is reminiscent of the fort itself, but not suggestive of the exact materials. The reinstallation of the stone marker is something that we've heard very strongly from both public and tribe. That is an important component. It is the connection and bridge between our 1860s past to our mid-20th century past to who we are today. And so it is an important part that we want to reveal and allow the people to engage it and as they would like. In this particular instance, the stone marker is positioned not in its original installation form, but in fact laying down almost in repose to change our perspective of how we see this thing that was installed with an intentionality to it, lest anyone be mistaken that its installation is in its original form. Reflection wall is something that you'll see throughout all of the different designs, where we want people from today to believe their mark. In fact, what we say today is as much as strong a message as what was said in 1859 when the stone marker was installed. And we are saying what we want to as a community around who we are in reflection to this. So we were inviting in the public voice to this area. I'm speaking a little bit more in detail around the first one, but you will see these elements replay in the next 3 concepts that are all different expressions of these core fundamental ideas. Design 2 is what we're referring to as a framed marker. And in this particular instance, materially, what we're using is perhaps something like a Core-10 steel that is aging and rusting within it. You'll see what are called loop holes or slots within it that are very common within forts of the day that are revealing and allowing people to see through it. And in this case, the stone marker is revealed through almost a set of framed doorways and a gateway that show the marker in removal. And in fact, as you go through this moment, you're seeing the back side of this marker rather than the front side. We're encouraging people to see this and then work their way around through the space. In this instance, then the reflection area is off to the side and sort of on the edge of the gathering area. In the top of this drawing here, you can see there's a large body of water or a sketch of that. This is one of the prominent features that Casey will touch upon when we're doing the loop, contemplation loop around it. So you're seeing across to a different portion of the site from this, and that vantage point is a really strong aspect of the site's quality. Design number 3, we're referring to as cardinal directions. And in this particular instance, you can see, and we've changed the view of where you're looking at the location. In the upper left-hand corner of this are some of the interpretive panels and as well the tactile map that express the physicality of the fort itself. And the stone marker is installed in this particular instance also in reverse, but in the center. And the cardinal directions or 8 cardinal directions are surrounding it with messages. The stone itself sits in the middle, and perhaps cut stones made of the same kind of local material are put around it that support these sort of fin-like structures with messages that include the reflection to it. So we're taking this materiality and we're reinterpreting this from today's perspective. We heard from our tribal partners in this as well too, that the idea of directionality is very important to them. Incidentally, this also serves as a sundial. And so we're starting to reflect how time and passage plays throughout this idea as well too. And then design number 4, we're referring to as passages. And so in this particular version of this, the fort walls, in fact, and the sort of gateways are presented in a sort of sequence so that as you're going from the more interpretive area and the more content-rich area into the more meaning-making and emotion-based learning, you are passing through a series of gateways that are reflective of the idea of the fort without truly representing the fort. In the near last one, the stone marker is reinstalled, sitting there interrupting your gateway. And then beyond that, there's a final framed view of that same waterway that I was mentioning before. And so now that you've experienced this powerful messaging, you're now looking out into this reclaimed space and thinking about who we are now in this new landscape that's been created through this understanding. And so this is a very brief description of what the intentionality or the drive is. Each of them get to the same kinds of ideas, but through a different sets of ways of experiencing and having it unfold.
Thanks, Seth. So now we're going to move into the contemplation loop. And here visitors are invited, kind of as the name suggests, to contemplate and reflect. And the focus here switches to native voices and knowledge. So we want to prompt reflection around what it means to stand on land shaped by care, violence, extraction, and now by healing. And there are several nodes, and some of the nodes have view sheds. Some of them offer sheltered space for reflection, seating, gathering, and some of them have some light interpretation. One in particular is the celestial sky, and stars, which we heard were important from the tribes. And so lastly, we have the reemergence area with a focus on present and the future, recognizing contemporary Indigenous present, understanding trauma is ongoing, not historical, and consider personal responsibility. So after a person has visited this site, what will you all carry forward? And so the reverse side of the Paired Voices Gateway signs affirm contemporary Indigenous presence, culture, and resilience. So as you head back to the arrival area, the Indigenous signs and the poles here are now the ones increasing in presence. So again, we'll have brief quotations or reflections that would be selected. Sources could include tribal representatives, members, youth groups, as well as settler descendants and or current Boulder residents. And so we have shared these all with our tribal representatives. And I guess a kind of a theme for this presentation is there was a lot more detail in the memo, kind of on some specific things. But overall, the support, there was support for the concepts and the direction that we were headed. There was support for the paired voices concept and the gateway and the artistic use of sod to share what the fort looked like. A lot of the tribal representatives, the cardinal directions, resonated with them, as well as the gateway concept. But with the gateway concept, there were some resonations, and then there was also some hesitations because it looked like some other monuments. So, kind of a discussion point there. There was support for reinterpreting the marker in the discovery area, which we heard from previous engagement windows. We talked a lot about the importance of how, the fort representation, the fort map can make clear, to where the fort was to the best of our ability, really why it was constructed and address assumptions about the fort. We heard that was very important. Also important, just really outlining the steps that were taken to manufacture fear at that time, and how that fear really grew and resulted into Sand Creek. So we kept on discussing how to, have that be important and central to this area. We heard support for the contemplation loop, also the reemergence, and the paired voices really affirming their presence here. So our next steps, we're hoping to launch a questionnaire for the broader community end of April. And then we'll go back and with partner with Seth. We're going to consider all the input. You know, we heard from the tribes, the community, you all. We're going to start refining those concepts. We're going to continue to collaborate with our tribal partners. That's kind of an iterative process. We'll see how many touches it takes. You know, we're just going to, it's an iterative design process. You know, we're collaborating with them. So it really is a partnership there. So we'll take the time to do that. And then we'll hoping to come back to the board Q3, Q4 with a final design presentation. And I will put the questions up here if these resonate with you and you want to answer any of those or share your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Casey. I'll open it up to the board. Any thoughts, questions you want to share?
I'll go, John. So first of all, thanks. This is great to see the way that this is evolving and all the care you're taking in it. I just wanted to speak to the incorporation of the marker, and I think all four of the concepts are really thoughtful, creative, and poignant, and just really amazing. All the concepts. I think start with the second one. You know, I love the sort of the way that the Corten plates have that negative space. And it talks to me a little bit about, you know, some negative, some loss, you know, and a void that's left. But then it's replaced when the plates come together and there's the marker floating in the air. And the third one, you know, cardinal directions are great. And one of the things that I love about that is that the marker becomes subservient. The marker is this little thing in the middle. It's sort of anticlimactic. And the fourth one, I also have some issues with, you know, not sure about the way that it's standing in my way of getting out. It's uncomfortable. Maybe it's meant to be uncomfortable. But the one that I liked the best was the first one, because when we heard from the tribal representatives, one of the elders, a guy named Chester, told us that there couldn't be healing until both sides of the story were told. And what I really like is I like the way that the marker is in repose, but also the way that it's being cradled by the poles, which represent the Native American side of the story, but the poles themselves are being supported by the sod. And that represents the settler side. So it's sort of pulling it all back together, but also laying it down. And so I don't know what others thought. It didn't sound like there was support for this one, but I think this speaks the most to me. And it's just been amazing to watch you develop these concepts.
This is not my area of expertise. So, but since you asked our opinion, I love the idea of great comments. I just personally like the idea of trying to recreate some of the materials. You know, we don't know what the fort looked like, but making that real for people. I like design one too. I'm not so sure about it's striking that the marker's in repose. It's almost like it's laying in state exactly. And is that, yeah, I mean, you know, obviously take the tribal representative's opinion way over mine. Is that what you're going for? Is that a little melodramatic? You know, I don't know, but I like um, I like the idea that you're using some of the materials that would have been there before and trying to, you know, get transporting people there in the reveal. And yeah, hats off to the thorough process here of our own little reconciliation process and design. It's admirable, and it's been fun to watch and participate in a small way.
Brady, did you want me to address your question?
Certainly, if you feel it's appropriate. Yeah.
Sure. I'll say that as designers of a site of conscience, we're very careful to not work in a direction that manipulates our visitor. And we want, at the same time, we want to provoke and we want to be able to have participants question, and by using this kind of expression, we're challenging the assumptions that they've made around something. I don't think that it's our job to have an outcome in mind around that, but rather to invite people to question what this thing is. That one in particular that you mentioned is very much, you can see the sort of settler and indigenous voice being quite married to each other. And that was the intent of this one, is that the expression very much reflects that kind of pairing in that expression. I hope that gives you a little thought of our thinking process.
Will you please remind me your name?
Sorry, Seth.
Seth. Thank you, Seth and Casey. Couple questions. What do you both and your team feel like this is equally for, or out of respect for tribes and tribal representatives, and for reflection for people who, you know, can, and what they get out of it is subjective, to your point just a minute ago? Or who would you say this is for? And when you do the design, who do you keep in mind?
It's definitely both. We've heard that, you know, it's both sides of the stories, and that we both need to come together. That's what we've heard so much from our tribal representatives. It's, you know, understanding our part, and it's coming together. It's about reconciliation, and so it is. You know, we've talked about bringing, you know, some of the tribal representatives have talked about bringing their youth down here. As part of the education. They don't have a lot, you know, they can go to Sand Creek, but that this really kind of talks about the mobilization. So it really is both, and it's really trying to tell both sides of the story. That's what we've heard is really important, that it not be one-sided, it not be focused on one or the other. So it really is both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for better or for worse, fear did influence a lot, and there's timeless lessons we can learn for everyone. Yeah. How did tribal representatives share? And I'm sorry if we've all covered this, but I'm curious. How have they and how will they continue to share what's important to them and their feedback on the designs? And was it through like traditional ways, or kind of a more of a traditional ways of sharing Indigenous knowledge versus what we do in terms of community engagement? Like,
Sure. It's been a little bit of both throughout this process. I mean, going back to 2021, sometimes we have invited them out. We've walked the site with them. We've just engaged in, you know, walks and talks. We've done at other times we do a Zoom call, because they are very busy traveling over many states, and there's a lot of calls on their time. So we've done a little bit of both. On site and remote. And then for this next phase, we'll probably reach out to them and ask if they'd like to come out, or if we want to do this over Zoom. How close are we? What type of discussions do we want to have? So it really is pretty collaborative. When we say collaboration, I don't think I have a slide on it tonight, Morgan, but I am using it in the sense of our city's engagement framework, where, you know, we do have, you know, consult and involve, and in consultation is at the far end of the spectrum, where we're not going to move forward unless we're all, you know, step in step. We're kind of co-creating this. So like I said, this next stage is it'll be a little bit iterative, just to make sure we get it right.
I'll just add that another form of integration, if you will, is at some of our community workshops, the tribe representatives were there with our community members. So we had 1 or 2 sessions in which both tribal representatives and community were interacting together and talking about ideas. Some of those were around idea boards. Others were rotating around and on tables where it was just conversation. And then we have another project that is tangentially related, but we have what we call an ethnographic project with the tribes, and that's oral storytelling, where they come out and we sit with them for a day or two of their tribal reps, and they just talk, and we try to document, and so oral storytelling is very important to them. And so we have that project, which is just talk based. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said, and I wasn't asking a leading question, but if one of you hadn't said storytelling, I was going to make sure that we can make room for that, and it's never too late. And so, but it sounds like that was a big part of it too, and an ongoing part. And not trying to fit a round tribal experience into a square kind of traditional community engagement whole, whatever the analogy. Last question for the next phase of input in the questionnaire. What are your objectives with that, and what kind of questions will you be asking, and then how will you use that feedback?
So there'll probably be similar questions to these shown on your screen. And there's similar questions that we've asked the tribe. The tribes really would like to know what the community thinks of these designs. Like we said, we're telling two stories, and it can't be one-sided. And so we'll take that input, we'll bring it back to the tribes. We are involving the community. So I'm in consulting with the tribes. So we have a little bit of a level of engagement difference there, but we're going to take all the feedback, come back and say, how do we manipulate these designs to meet all interests to the best that we can? Because we want to meet the community's interest and have this be a site that resonates and will work for the community in understanding this site too. So that's really important. So we're going to use it to just help us evolve these designs and make it a meaningful experience.
Yeah, it does seem cohesive, and the paired voices seems really thoughtful and just helpful to bring people along. And when I look at the different concepts, I think about giving people the physical space to reflect and not feeling. And I understand the depth of trying to communicate the experience and the history, but also giving people physical space to be comfortable pausing and staying somewhere, and just how people flow. I mean, it's probably your expertise too, just how people flow through the experience. And so, if anything, to add on to what Brady and Armin said, the concepts or designs that I would prefer are ones that just give us more space to reflect individually. John, I'm finished. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. And we did have the tribal leaders out to a board meeting. I think it was a couple years ago now. We got to sit down with them, and we actually got to have dinner with them ahead of the board meeting and talk and ask questions, and it was an incredibly valuable experience. And I was talking to one of them, and I can't remember if it was in the meeting or while we were having dinner, but he said, our story's been told. Make sure you tell the settler story when you build this. So the concept of the paired voices, I think, really captures that bit of feedback that we got in the conversation with them. So I'm a big fan of how y'all have kind of thought through the paired voices concept. I really like the materials in terms of kind of incorporating both different types of materials and the sod. I felt like that was great. Um, and everything felt really cohesive. And I was trying to decide which one I liked best. I did kind of I did enjoy the first one, honestly. I'm not sure. Like Brady said, this is not my area of expertise. But after hearing Morgan talk about the space, this type of thing is a lot to take in, and I think it would be valuable to give folks space to kind of take this in and process it at their own pace. So I think that was a really good bit of feedback there, Morgan, that I would say I definitely agree with. Um, and yeah, really appreciate you coming out and chatting with us, Seth, and thanks for your time, Casey.
Of course. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. All right, we're going to transition. We're going to bring to you our next discussion of wildfire resilience. As you know, we've had a number of touches with you over the last couple of years. And I should ask, do you guys want to take 3 or 4 minutes break? Why don't we do that?
That sounds good.
Why don't we come back at 8:20, is that okay?
Perfect.
All right.
5-minute break.
we've started the recording again.
All right, I guess that's me. I'm over here now. Because when it comes to wildfire resilience, it takes a lot of us to address from y'all. But as I was describing before we took a break, this is a topic, Morgan, that we've been engaging with the board for the last few years and several times every year. And this is another touch around wildfire resilience. The primary purpose going into tonight, as we were thinking about it this winter, is springtime is a really busy time for us in terms of fuels mitigation work, especially around fuels mitigation work in the wildland urban interface, as we think about what that means from an open space perspective. But we also know that the recent fires, two recent closures of the system based on very severe weather events, also has prompted some interest in the board of talking about the idea of closures and what did we see in that? Were they effective? That type of thing. So we expanded the conversation to address a few different topic areas. So one being the idea of closures and the second being fuels mitigation work within the WUI. So with that, I am going to hand it over to the team. And I think Brian Aneker, our senior manager for science and climate resilience, is going to kick us off.
Thank you, Dan. Good evening, trustees. I just want to start with a reminder of where we've been with OSBT over the last 3 years or so. We've had 13 different touches with the board, study sessions, business meetings like tonight, retreats, written information, field trips. So just wanted to emphasize that that recognizes our ongoing commitment to bringing the board along, keeping you informed, and using the Open Space Board really to talk to our community about wildfire resilience on behalf of a lot of our partner departments in the city. As Dan mentioned, we're going to talk about hazard closures. Jeff and I will take that piece, and then we'll turn it over to Paul for part 2. The big update was made on our community wildfire protection plan in 2024, working with several city departments and a consultant called SWCA. We published that update. The backbone or the DNA of that plan really revolves around 3 national cohesive strategies: fire adapted communities, resilient landscapes, and safe and effective wildfire response. Those are the buckets in which we put our work and use that framing to have the conversation with the community. That third one was on full display this morning with the fire at the Sanitas area, for example. You'll hear from Paul on some of the fuel management stuff that fits within that middle bin of resilient landscapes. And fire adapted communities includes a lot of material such as home hardening, homeowner grants, risk reduction within the built environment. When we were thinking about implementation of the CWPP, we chose to build a robust wildfire resilience team. The photograph on the bottom right are representatives of the 10 city departments that form that team. And as we were planning implementation, we were still taking feedback from the community and staff. And one thing we discovered was that ignition prevention was an important gap or a priority or an opportunity for us to do some additional focusing on above and beyond what was described in the CWPP. And that's a good connection to talking about closures tonight. And then another major catalyst for focusing on closures, as Dan mentioned, were the wind events, especially the December wind event where we did a system-wide closure. In the review of the actions taken there, we agreed that we wanted to study closures in terms of the guidelines that lead to the decision to do a closure and when to lift, but also study the procedures that our staff can use to prepare to put a closure in place, manage the compliance, and deal with safety-related issues and recovery. So in terms of closures, we start with the why. Why would we close the system to prevent hazards? The main reasons are listed here: to protect our resources, natural resources, cultural, agriculture, visitor infrastructure resources from loss from catastrophic wildfire, for example. We'd like to reduce risk to our own staff as well as our visitors, in part because reduced visitation means there's lower probability of creating an emergency. That would be an emergency within an emergency that would require response being distracted from responding to a fire. Related there is keeping our roads and trails clear to allow emergency response to be as efficient as possible, doing our part in that regard. The guidelines that we're developing currently are really focused on wildfire for the reasons I mentioned, but we're hoping they can be scaled and general enough to apply to other hazards, in particular floods. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a partial or full system closure of open space land to public and third parties. That these closures would also be distinct from other kinds of closures you're familiar with, such as muddy trail closures, seasonal wildlife closures, or incident-based law enforcement closures. And in terms of how these work, the first thing to think about is who are the decision makers here. As we've been studying this and learning from our two events, we've recognized that the so-called policy group, which at its core is the Office of Disaster Management Board of Directors. So Mike Chard is our director of ODM. He brings together the City of Boulder City Manager, the Boulder County Sheriff, the Chief of Police, the Fire Chief, and the Boulder County Administrator in what we call a policy group. Usually this is in association with the Emergency Operations Center, the EOC. And then that group forms the core that could make a decision like this. But that core can have additional staff brought into it. For example, Dan often joins the policy group if the scale of the event is especially large. City managers from neighboring towns will join the policy group. Another piece of the decision making here is that there is no single trigger that leads to a closure being recommended. There's often multiple considerations, and it's up to the professional judgment of this policy group to make a recommendation. Other parts of the how Jeff will talk more about in terms of how we would staff up and manage our infrastructure to close the system and the kinds of communications campaigns we would have for our community and also communications to our staff. Compliance wise, we know we have a really large system, many access points. We often call it a porous system. It's really difficult to close. And so we are still studying the compliance piece, but we are going to need this to see largely voluntary compliance. We're hoping visitors will choose not to come once they receive the information, as opposed to the expectation that we'll have uniformed staff at each and every access point actively turning people away. So there's a little study in contrast of the December event and the March event left and right. The conditions for December were pretty dire. We had really accurate weather forecasts that we were going to receive extreme winds, and we did. Those winds lasted for 3 days consecutive. Along with that, we had a first ever PDS from the National Weather Service, a particularly dangerous situation. So that definitely raised our eyebrows. And of course, thousands of people had their power turned off as part of the Excel PSPS, Public Safety Power Shutoff. So pretty severe conditions out on the system in mid-December. In terms of the closure itself, Boulder County Parks and Open Space announced it would be closing their system, and that was on a Thursday. They announced that they would close for Friday. Following that, the policy group convened and consulted with Dan and announced a closure for OSMP would also be put in place. That came down late in the day, Thursday, when a lot of our staff who work 410s are already rolled off. However, we were able to put that closure in place first thing Friday morning. Kudos to a huge number of staff involved there. And then that same closure was lifted about 24 hours later. The weather had improved and we actually had really good conditions on Saturday. So pretty impressive turnaround there. Results were we had no fires on the system. We had a huge list of damages coming in from staff in the community. Last count, there were 53 documented damages there everything you can imagine. Trees down, branches down, infrastructure blown away, fences down, and the like. Compliance, we'll talk about that more in a moment, but it was pretty good based on our both objective and subjective analysis of that event. Moving into March, a little different context. We had again extreme winds forecast, but that forecast was not as accurate. They were predicted to come later in the day, 1400 hours. So there was really great weather in the morning, and those winds came, but they were nowhere near what they were in December. It was also March, so it was much warmer, and it was a Saturday, so the conditions were not real favorable for pulling this closure off in style. Excel didn't issue a PSPS, but they issued an EPSS, which is an enhanced power line safety setting, which is just a way to say it's a more limited and strategic power shutdown. People in Boulder did lose power, but nowhere near the magnitude from December. Similar to last time, Boulder County announced they were going to do their closure one day in advance. Earlier in the day, the policy group followed on and decided to close. A difference here is only the western mountain parks were closed this time. And in December, the full system was closed. Kudos to staff, again, with short notice, put that closure in place for Saturday and lifted it on Sunday. As a result, again, no fires, very limited damage. We only had one in our staff accounting sheet. Compliance, not nearly as good as what we saw in December. So an interesting thing about our system is that thanks to Colin Leslie and his coworkers, we have a way to quantify visitation to open space system, and we can use that data to understand what a baseline expectation for visitation would be and what visitation looked like during the closure. So what we're seeing here, for example, is that at Flatirons Vista, based on what we would expect, based on a 5-week look back in terms of baseline visitation for Saturday in March, visitation observed during that day of closure was 90% of what we'd expect. So that seems like a good news story. However, as Jeff will point out, that's in the south part of our system. It has a really good system for gating, and so it's easy to close that. Another way to say that is it's a hard closure. In contrast, up below Chautauqua, visitation was reduced by 68%. That still left over 300 visits based on that one trail counter that was measuring it there. And beyond these quantitative numbers, we can tell the story even better in pictures. Oh, 92% reduction in December. So yeah, we did better in December for that access point than we did in March. Brady sent these along. Thank you, Brady, for sharing. This kind of shows what the scene was like on March 14th. And Brady, you can speak to these more later if you like. But what I see here is a police line with visitors on both sides of the tape. You can see visitors kind of gathering at the entrance, trying to read the situation. They've probably seen a sign. They've seen some police tape. They see a packed parking lot and they see visitors up the trail. So it's a really difficult situation for them to know what they're supposed to do. And it's very luring to cross the tape because it sure doesn't feel like fire weather when you're standing out there in those conditions. Also, just note from our own staff, this was a very difficult situation for them to be in as well, in terms of having to interact with visitors and explain the reason for the closure and just the number of people that were there, not being able to do the contacts they would like to do with each and every individual. So they would be engaging a group of 2 or 3, and another group of 4 or 5 would walk right past them, and it put them in a tough spot in terms of what do you do with that information. So with that, I'm ready to turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So again, Jeff Haley, I'm the Deputy Director for our Visitor Experience and Infrastructure. It's nice to meet you, Morgan. Welcome to the board. As Brian mentioned, this is really kind of a 2-phase approach or 2-prong approach. The piece that we've really been focused on is the infrastructure approach. And as he showed in that previous slide, we're really looking at what are we trying to accomplish with these closures? What's the overall goal and purpose? And he kind of laid out some of those key goals that we're focused on. And our approach now is to really develop more of a process and procedure to how we do this and what are the methods and the tools and the means by which we can close the system. And we're still right in the middle of the process. You know, each one of these events, as Brian highlighted, we've learned a little bit. We've done after action reviews, assessed the data, looked at what we can do. And so this is kind of an outline of what that SOP or standard operating procedure will include. And I also want to highlight Hillary Deese, who you all met recently when we talked about Boulder Falls. She's our senior manager for visitor infrastructure. In fact, she's on the meeting this evening remotely, but her team, as well as our rangers, have done a tremendous job implementing these closures. As Brian mentioned, it's been quick. It's been kind of rapid response and done a successful job so far. And this is a chance then that we can kind of come alongside and say, okay, what did we learn and how do we want to do that differently? Obviously, with that being said, we have clear roles and responsibilities. Who decides, who makes the call, what are the staff teams that are involved, who goes in with and does the closure, who lifts the closure, based on time of day and that sort of thing. And then obviously the closure procedure itself. Today was a great example. In fact, this photo is from our reactive closure today, this morning with the goat trail fire. So we want to assess the situation, what needs to be closed and why. And then the physical deployment is really the big lift. I'll talk in a moment, we're categorizing or kind of assessing the system and creating zones, almost like a zone defense approach of, figuring out which areas make sense to close and based on visitor behavior. How do we notify or send out messaging to our community and our visitors? And then how do we kind of do that coupled with evacuations? A lot of times these events, if it's a reactive closure, kind of like today, we might need evacuations or we have folks going in while we're trying to get folks out as well. So a lot of this will go into that protocol or that SOP, including kind of the end of the closure as well. How do we monitor the closure and then when do we reopen or how do we do that? Again, this image is kind of telling. You can see it's a bit of what we call a belt and suspenders approach. So you have the we call it a VMS, but it's a variable message sign right there informing drivers and vehicles as they're coming in. Trails closed, trailheads closed. You can see in the background there, we actually have a ranger who is stationed there at a physical sign and barricade. So that's the other process that we're trying to have kind of all these different means and methods that we can communicate with the visitors to be successful. As Brian just mentioned in March, that was kind of a challenge, because we don't have all those things in all the different places. You can go to the next slide. And so with that being said, how do we determine our approach? Again, you see in this image, there's clearly a permanent gate there that's really nice and easy to lock. It has a sign on it. But when we think about this graph, it's basically just showing Hillary and her team kind of put this together to show, the closures, a lot of times the two main closures have been preventative. How do we prevent accidents, prevent emergencies, prevent visitors from being harmed or even prevent wildfire? Versus today was very much reactive. We had a fire on the system. We needed to close for access to emergency first responders and that sort of thing. And it really comes down to the data that Brian presented. It really can be attributed to, is the system occupied? Is it during the day, a lot of visitors out, or is it more unoccupied or clear? In December, the decision was made to close and we were able to go out. It was just decided on Thursday. We were able to go out early Friday morning. 3 a.m. You guys know the system. People are out all times of early morning running or climbing or what have you. So we were able to close it before many trailheads were full. Many visitors were on the system, much more effective. And it also depends on the response approach. Are we trying to close the entire system, like a long duration event, all access points, or is it more of a narrow kind of targeted approach like the March event we just did, the western half, kind of the mountain backdrop? So that's kind of, you can read, I won't go through all the details there, but that really dictates how we allocate staff, how we've kind of assigned resources, what capacity we have to be successful. And again, the outcome really, if it's a quick decision and there's people out there and we're trying to close it, or maybe a Saturday morning before, we didn't get out in time before folks are out on the system, then we're kind of having to leave gates open while people exit. We can't fully close it. We're having to communicate a lot with different visitors who are literally walking in, as you saw in Chautauqua in March. So that sort of thing. You can go to the next one. And so multiple entry points, as Brian mentioned, it's a very porous system. In fact, Boulder County even has a little bit of advantage. Some of their open space areas have maybe one driveway into one trailhead, one gate that can be closed. We're right along the community, as we know. 37 trailheads, 76 different access points. I mean, there's many places. So this is kind of just one example. I talked about that zone determination. We've looked at maybe upwards of 20 different zones throughout the system. This would be the Anemone Red Rocks area. So you guys are familiar with that area. We have, just to the south of Sanitas. And so in that one zone, we have 6 different major access points where people access. Some of those, not many have gates. And so we're using very kind of temporary closure strategies, signage, tape, etc. And so we've documented that basically to show our team, like, here's the zone, here's how we close that one. But it's highlighting all those vulnerabilities or those gaps. It's a lot more, time intensive, takes a lot more time to get out and deploy. We have to carry resources with us, like these materials. And it's just harder to keep the visitors out and to kind of secure the area. You can go to the next one. These images are a little small for this scale, but basically what this is showing is that same general zone, Red Rocks, Anemone, and then it kind of even more specifically identifies each of those access points and then talks about the action item that is used to close. VMS, variable message sign, A-frames, they're the standard kind of sandwich board, signicades that we have, temporary signs you just saw. So we've documented that. What this is going to help us do, again, is not only be successful in making these closures currently, but in this spirit of budget development and really understanding cost, we're able now, in fact, that's the work we're doing now, is to look at, okay, what would it cost to include gates, either pedestrian gate, vehicular gate, or some other type of infrastructure that would allow us to close and secure the area. So a lot of data collection, a lot of analysis, and then this is kind of the means and methods we're using now to deploy staff and resources kind of in this interim phase while we're still learning through all of this. We can go to the next slide. So again, this is a bit of an exhibit, kind of more, this was based on the March closure. Again, it's mainly just the western half of the system. Some of that might be smaller font, but again, we broke it into different zones, and it kind of highlights the zones that we can close, that have that infrastructure. Basically what we did is we send staff out to those areas to secure the gates, lock the gates, that sort of thing. And then unfortunately, a lot of those areas that we couldn't close, then we rely on rangers or our education outreach staff to just truly be on site and try to discourage visitors from proceeding. And these, as you all know, those are some of our most visited areas and highest populous or populated areas. So those are where we're really focusing, like what can we do, what can we change there. And again, it's a pretty nimble, we almost go or have gone case by case, location by location in terms of what would be the most appropriate. But again, this is a situation where reactive versus preventative or proactive. I mean, it's no different than CDOT closing Highway 93 when the high wind warning is, we know that wind can topple semis and vehicles, or I-70 closes during a winter storm. We have enough crashes, then we're putting the safety and our emergency responders at risk. So it's that same kind of example methodology of how do we do that. Like Brian mentioned a minute ago, I mean, obviously we close muddy trails now for preventative and somewhat reactive when we have weather events. We have different closure protocols that we go through, but this is really a new one to look at our whole system. So next steps that we're working on, you can go to the next slide, specifically for closures. like I said, we're right in the midst of this, working through it. We didn't provide a lot of detail tonight because we're still sorting through that. In fact, we're going to have some more workshops on these guidelines and procedures to really make sure our staff are aligned. Just today, for example, we had different role people in serving in different roles and learning how to support those roles. So we want to make sure we're aligned on what the best process and procedure is. Working with our peer agencies, Larimer County, Boulder County, Jeffco, and learn from what they're doing and or how they do things, specifically Boulder County with some of their closures. Brian mentioned the citywide policy group, certainly running that through them, because when the decision's made, we want to make sure our decision makers know what that means. You know, it may sound pretty simple to say, hey, let's close it. But it takes a lot of time and energy and resources and money and those sorts of things. And we want to be careful with the public's trust. You know, when we close it, we want the community to say, okay, that made sense. Or what are you guys doing out here? You know, so, and then, like I said, cost and priorities. We've talked a lot this evening, even Mr. Delamere in the public comment, you know, Dan, what's the cost of all that? So we want to try to answer as much as that we can for the closure piece of it. And we'll be including that in some future budget discussions, just to make sure we can, if we're going to invest and do these closures and continue with that, like what's going to be the true cost of doing that. So I think my next portion, we're turning over to Paul, and we'll do questions at the end.
Yeah, I think if you are okay holding your questions, and we'll get through all the presentation and then open it up for questions for both topics, just so we can make sure we get through it. Okay, great. Thank you.
Good evening, trustees, and hello, Morgan. I'm Paul Dennison. I'm the Wild and Fire Senior Program Manager at Open Space and Mountain Parks. And I am noticing the time, so I'll try to move through my slides quickly, more quickly than I would like to, and preserve some time for question and answer. But I'm going to talk about the wild and urban interface and hazardous fuels management, and an appropriate topic based on some of the questions and comments we heard earlier in the evening. And I wish that some of the commenters, in addition to Mr. Orr, had stuck around so they could hear some of the plans for project implementation and additional strategy for managing risk in the wild and urban interface. So I do want to talk about kind of the foundational concepts of what the wild and urban interface is and what we are really talking about when we talk about risk in the wild and urban interface, and then how that's informing our efforts to develop a comprehensive and appropriate strategy for reducing risk. Next slide. So the concept of wildfire risk, we all know intuitively that fire is destructive, but risk is a fairly complex set of interactions between these four risk factors. The likelihood that a fire will occur, what is exposed to the areas where fire could occur, those values at risk, homes, lives, the natural environment itself, and other things, how susceptible are they to being damaged or destroyed, and then the potential intensity of the fire that could impact those values. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I want to show how these risk factors map onto the city of Boulder, and again, with the interest of how and a good understanding of wildfire risk informs our strategies to reduce risk, primarily through fuels management being the main topic I'll talk about tonight. So the map on the left gives an illustration of susceptibility of values at risk. And when we talk about the wild and urban interface, it's there's no one real common definition, but generally we're referring to where people live and where those areas meet or intermingle with areas that could experience wildland fire. So this map shows open space and mountain parks land shaded in green and generally on the west of residential Boulder. And these color-coded shapes within the city are residential neighborhoods that have been defined by the city as in the wild and urban interface. And the color coding just shows how close those buildings are to each other. That's just one of the many factors that determines how susceptible those homes or those neighborhoods are to potential wildfire impacts and damage. And then on the right, this shows Boulder in relation to vegetation mapping at a 30-meter resolution. So I'm sure you're all well aware, but many parts of the city of Boulder are directly exposed to quite large extents of natural areas and vegetation. There's a lot of direct exposure, so homes directly adjacent to natural areas, And then we're also concerned about and wanting to mitigate against the potential for embers to be produced and for those to be transported into residential areas, impacting homes primarily. Next slide, please. Then the other two risk factors are the likelihood of fire occurrence and the potential intensity of fire. Likelihood of occurrence is something that's really best understood at a fairly large scale. There's quite complex modeling that goes into establishing relative likelihood of occurrence, running lots of wildfire simulations, and essentially the number of times that a point on the map burns indicates that that's more likely to experience fire. It has a lot to do with the continuity and extent of natural areas. In Boulder, we have relatively high likelihood of fire occurrence. It's also not a risk factor that can be very thoroughly mitigated against. However, these gentlemen were talking about many of our efforts to reduce the likelihood of human-caused wildfire ignitions. So there is one facet of likelihood of occurrence that through patrols, through preventative closures, and other actions we can make some meaningful change surrounding. Then potential intensity, that just refers to how quickly fires can spread, how long the flame lengths are, and the fire type, whether it's surface fire, trees torching, canopy fire, with more intense wildfire generating more embers, posing more difficulty for fire suppression and higher likelihood of damage or destruction resulting from a fire. And it's primarily the potential intensity of fire that we're able to change through vegetation management, through hazardous fuels management. Next slide. So by and large, whether it's through mowing, prescriptive grazing, tree thinning, ditch fuels management, and other methods, what we're trying to do is promote the likelihood that if a fire occurs, regardless of the weather conditions, what we want to see is low intensity surface fire. So shorter grasses with less of a thatch layer, trees that are appropriately spaced and more reflective of historic conditions, with ladder fuels or the lower limbs and more immature trees properly managed. All of that promotes the likelihood that fire stays on the surface and it's not high intensity or fast moving fire. And we achieve that through reducing the fuel loads, changing the structure, fuel height, spacing, and disrupting the continuity. So that's both horizontally across the landscape and vertically. That vertical continuity changes seeks to ensure that the fire stays on the surface rather than transitioning into trees and taller vegetation. And then very importantly, the goal of fuels management isn't to eliminate fire from the landscape or to stop a fire without any kind of intervention. These treatments are designed to improve first responder access and the likelihood that firefighters can safely engage wildfires. And it complements home hardening and defensible space, the risk reduction actions that are arguably most important that are the responsibility of homeowners to pursue. Next slide, please. So all this leads to our effort to really define what we're referring to when we talk about the wild and urban interface, specifically on City of Boulder open space and mountain parks managed lands, and how that complements all of the strategies in the other three cohesive strategy framing that Brian alluded to, the homeowner assessments, grants, response initiatives, and so forth that reduce risk in the built environment. What space are we talking about in open space and mountain parks managed lands, and what treatment standards are recommended, or what guidance can we follow to design projects, and how do those change in different distances from residential neighborhoods in Boulder. So what we are working on now, and I've talked with you a lot about pilot projects, with grass management being increasingly important and that being sort of a cutting edge in wildfire risk reduction, is looking at guidance around reducing risk in the home ignition zone within the first 100 feet of homes, longstanding guidance around tree work and creating fuel breaks within 100 to 300 feet. And as Mr. Orr alluded to, this is now guidance that's being broadened to encompass grass management recommendations. And then the largest distance is 1,500 feet, which is indicated by a lot of research as a long range, not the longest, but a likely long range transport distance for embers. So within that 1,500 feet distance, that's more strategic locations like roadways, ridges, waterways, and then also just more sort of ecosystem and landscape scale work that reduces the likelihood of high intensity fire that could produce embers. And so what we are now trying to design projects that are informed by these various standards, which change based on the distance from homes. But very importantly, all of this is intended to complement very widespread and very comprehensive strategies throughout all of the 70 square miles that we manage. So very comprehensive ecosystem management and other activities, agricultural management, that all reduces wildfire risk. But as we move into these areas nearest to residential neighborhoods, having a kind of primary objective of reducing risk to those communities. Next slide. Let's just move right past this, please. So we have a variety of treatment methods, and I think we've introduced you to many of them. Tree thinning, just the cleanup of dead and down woody fuels, mowing and grazing being some of our newer initiatives to mitigate risk in the grass dominant portions of our wildland urban interface. Prescribed fire is something that we're putting a lot of energy behind, but probably needless to say, with all of the elevated risk conditions that we've been facing during the spring, which is typically the most likely time to implement prescribed fire, we haven't had any really zero implementation windows for prescribed fire. So that's been an unfortunate barrier to a very important tool in mitigating risk. And then also factoring in existing features, as I mentioned, roads, trails, waterways. Prairie dog colonies are actually very effective fuel breaks, although controversial in certain ways and not something that we're designing, but just acknowledging when we do develop risk reduction plans and previously burned areas in wildfires. One of the commenters referred to some of our cross-boundary fuels management projects, and this is a kind of a closer up view at what these distances from residential communities look like. So you can see the various color shades extending out from residential neighborhoods. It's hard to see, but some of the darkest red in the nearest areas to homes, that's the first 30 feet or zones 1 and 2 of the home ignition zone. The most sort of aggressive fuels management standards are indicated in that area. Then the slightly lighter shade of red is the 100-foot home ignition zone, or some of the narrower ranges of fuel breaks. The orange is a 300-foot area. That's really the crucial fuel break width and where we're focusing most of our efforts now. And then the 1,500-foot more strategic treatment opportunity and ember cast risk reduction. But then what I've outlined in blue is our many green spaces in South Boulder, the Shanahan Ridge neighborhood. And we've been working with 8 of the HOAs. They're all contiguous, and they manage about 20 acres of green spaces that have very similar fuel characteristics to city managed lands just to the south and the west. And what this illustrates is that fuels management isn't solely the responsibility of public land managers or open space and mountain parks. If we really want to see comprehensive and complete projects to reduce hazardous fuels and reduce potential fire intensity, we need to also find ways of addressing fuel hazards on private land. And so we have several pilot projects, and we've completed several where we work with adjacent landowners to have those complete projects that blend as seamlessly as possible right into the values at risk, the homes and neighborhoods themselves. Go to the next slide. So in 2026, we are continuing and expanding a lot of the grass management in particular. We have a very grass dominant wild and urban interface, of heavy focus on the first 300 feet, especially in Western Boulder, where we have the most alignment with prevailing winds that drive destructive fires or problematic fires in the past. There are a lot of new and ongoing strategic treatments in that 300-foot to 1,500-foot range. And what I show on this map is sectioning of the natural areas in the wild and urban interface. And while we're implementing a lot of new and ongoing work in these areas, also aiming to conduct formal inventories of each of these sections of wild and urban interface natural areas. So looking at every portion of the first 1,500 feet and working to develop scopes of work in these areas, while also balancing areas that are ecologically sensitive, balancing visitor experience, view shed, and many other considerations. So again, primarily or importantly, implementing while we continue to assess and work towards a real comprehensive strategy. Next slide. So just focusing on North Boulder, yeah, it's quite a lot of work to try to display on a map through actual treatment shapes or polygons. So what I have here are 5 of the sections in the western portion of Boulder and then the northern half. So starting with Mapleton and extending north. And yeah, this is, sorry, not very well geographically arranged, but in Wonderland Lake, we have grant-funded work that is funding one of these pilot cross-boundary projects, also partnering with Boulder Parks and Recreation there. So we're introducing and continuing perimeter mowing, strategic grazing, pretty widespread juniper shrub removal, tree pruning, deciduous vegetation dead and down cleanup. Really, virtually every one of those fuels management treatment approaches that I referenced in an earlier slide is at play there. Just to the south of the Wonderland Lake area, the Newlands area, we completed a really good project with the Academy Senior Living Facility, conducting a fuel break within the first 300 feet that was on open space managed lands, in addition to the private lands managed by the Academy Senior Living Facility, with ditch work in that area, and now this year extending north, and the introduction of prescriptive grazing in the areas between Mapleton and Wonderland Lake. That's receiving the same treatment. Next slide. And then continuing kind of north to south here, Dakota Ridge is a community that has a perimeter road around it, so there's less of an imperative for grass management, or at least nothing to manage within the first 30 feet. Also, quite a lot of prairie dog colony presence there, so good fuel disruption. But for this year, we're targeting juniper shrub removal within the home ignition zone on city managed lands, some additional tree pruning to achieve that ladder fuel reduction, and considering roadside mowing. It's, again, a lot of these standards for grass treatment are emerging. So the presence of the road is a really good break in the grass fuel continuity, but looking if we should be improving that barrier to wildfire by some targeted mowing. And then moving south from there, continued prescriptive grazing, very light tree pruning. This is a very grass dominant area. Some deciduous litter and dead and down management within the 300 feet. First 300 feet is planned this year. And then the next section, you can see that middle portion, we manage land that is kind of outside of the 300-foot range and up to 1,500 feet. And there's really nothing indicated in fuel management standards that we need to be doing there, except to explore future cross-boundary collaborative efforts. Boulder Parks and Recreation manages the land just to the east that is near to those communities. So we're always interested in partnering with them on projects, but nothing specific planned there apart from some passive grazing, as we use grazing prescriptively to manage grass fuel loads in these other areas. So all of this taken together in North Boulder, what we're looking at is really a almost comprehensive strategy to achieve the standards that we're looking for in those different ranges. The first 100 feet in the home ignition zone, fuel breaks, and then strategic treatments to reduce ember loads. And sorry that we're running over time, but I hope we have a little bit of time for questions or discussion if you have any follow-up.
And I'll just add, we didn't have time to go through the whole zone, but there's a lot of strategies in South Boulder as well. We just thought we'd focus on North Boulder to give you the flavor of what we're doing throughout the Western WUI. So we had to pick and choose what we wanted to present to you tonight. But for those who are listening, living in the South, we're working on that too.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul, Brian, and Jeff, for coming to chat with us today. I'll open it up to questions from the board. Brady, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have three comments, questions. Thank you for throwing this together and coming in and talking to us about it. And Paul, some members of the public wanted you to know that they're still listening. They just had to go home and take care of their kids or other things. But even though it's empty here, there's still a few of them still listening. Yeah, thanks for sharing also my photos. And I just think if if we think that a closure could stop a catastrophic fire, we can do better. At Chautauqua, there was police tape, no interpretation at all in terms of why it was there. And so I was watching people just coming up and they're asking themselves, they look around, like you said, the parking lot's full. The Ranger Cottage is even closed. I was there around 4 o'clock, close to a little after when the peak wind event was supposed to happen. There was nobody there. There was no sign that said why. The whiteboard, the side of the cottage said something, and people had no idea. Gregory Canyon may have been closed. People were going in and out. Sanitas, there was one parking lot that was blocked off, but there wasn't even police tape. People were just walking willy nilly, had no idea there was a closure, and so. And I'm not trying to point fingers. You guys did the best you could on short notice, but I'm just saying we don't have to do too many studies to know we can do better. And people, I think we need physical barriers, and people need to know why. And then if they go, they're jerks or worse, right? But they shouldn't have a leg to stand on if they violate that closure. And for thousands of dollars, not maybe tens of thousands, but not hundreds and not millions, we can get there with physical barriers and signage, so that even in our poor system, at least those gateway places, if someone violates it, they know they're a jerk, and hopefully there's going to be somebody who screams at them because they believe that their house is going to burn down. So again, kudos for the steep learning curve we're all on. This is not meant to scold, but just to say we can do better. And if we really believe these closures can stop the next catastrophic event, we have to do better the next time it comes up. So that's one thing. So we just had 3 fires recently. And I'll put all these together and then you can answer them as you will. Has any of our mitigation work on open space resulted in potentially a better outcome from these 3? Kudos for the quick. I mean, the one that happened in Chautauqua, I was there 20 minutes. I must have been there right when the ignition was happening. I didn't notice it. And as I was walking down, I climbed the first flat iron, and when I was walking down, the fire trucks were coming up. That response was real quick. So I'm just curious to know, has our mitigation resulted in better outcomes? Why did we just have 3? What is going on? Are these people smoking blunts, or is this homelessness? I mean, maybe we don't know, but I would love at least some guesses. And then the final thing is, we had a member of the public suggest that we spent $8 million of the OSMP budget on fire mitigation tonight. And that's a former city council member. This is somebody who knows what she's talking about. And so if we were to very aggressively increase the pace of our work and presume that we put a lot of money behind it, where that comes from, we can talk another time. What would that look like?
I'll address the last question first. So just a little bit of context, and we can provide, some trim data. So we've doubled our resources, monetary resources, on wildfire resilience in just the last couple of years. So we're around $4 million right now is dedicated to wildfire resilience. I believe it was like 1.5 starting in, right after Marshall was sort of a baseline year that we're looking at. So we've more than doubled our financial resources to it. The gentlemen, Paul and Brian, are both part of a new program area. So we actually have stood up a science and climate resilience program area, which wildfire is probably 90% of your work. So we have new staffing for that. So what would it mean to double Paul and Brian's work? That's a really great question. And it probably is a combination of boots on the ground. A lot of this, and you probably have seen it in CIP, there's not a lot of CIP dollars associated with this work. It's actually physical labor work. Obviously, we talked about the Ready to Work crew, which is a big bread and butter for Paul. But that's boots on the ground. And certainly, I think if we were to double our resources, we would be looking at having to increase capacity in terms of boots on the ground, whether it's contractor work, whether it's staffing. And the one thing that we're being sensitive to is moving the shells around. Like our forestry crew. We could sort of say, let's take all of your forestry crew and stop what you're doing there and come work here, where then we're sort of choosing to, stop doing one thing so we can do another. We would love to be able to do both. Rather than sort of borrowing from one area in order to accelerate another area. So that's top of mind too. But every year we're increasing our resources for wild resilience. And I think we would love to look at 2027 as what is the next level of advancements in this work. And I think it's going to be, how do we fund Paul's work of looking at the first 1,500 feet? We're starting to strategize of what that looks like. We're going to be developing treatments for the first 1,500 feet, primarily focused on the first 300. What are those, for us to do those treatments every year and then maintain them? You just don't leave them alone and you're done forever. We're going to hopefully answer a lot of those questions of what it's going to take for us. And Paul, happy to invite your, but I think boots on the ground is probably a common theme for what it's going to take.
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add to that, Dan. I think that's just right. So if you have a follow-up question, Brady, that I can speak to, I'd be happy to. Oh, yeah.
The other question is the three fires, why they started.
Yeah.
And did our management, has any of our mitigation work on the system outside of the 1,500 feet have an impact on those?
So the first question, what caused the fires? They're very likely human caused, and this is information coming from our ranger work group, and we have a wildfire investigator who's involved in investigations in all of these fires. So the investigations aren't complete, so I can't say more than very likely human caused, but that's what we're hearing from them. And the investigations are still open. So
yeah, we have the Enchanted Mesa and the Goat are open investigations, so there's really no comment we can make at that time. I could say for all three fires, they've ruled out natural causes. So that is pointing toward human caused ignition. And the Goat fire, each of the three has different approaches to who's leading the investigation. The recent Goat fire is actually under the state purview. It's been determined, so the state investigator is heading that one up, but those are open investigations. So hopefully we'll learn something soon.
And then whether mitigation has had an impact on these fires, that's a really interesting question. I know the fire from several days ago did burn in an area that has been treated, so it very likely improved the ability for firefighters to quickly and safely suppress that fire. It's hard to make absolute claims because we just don't know how fire would have behaved under untreated conditions, and obviously we're very concerned and trying to design these treatments to stand up against very strong wind-driven wildfires, which we've been a bit lucky just in the relatively calm winds that have accompanied the recent fires.
One thing I'll just note too, from not necessarily fuels, but both of the Enchanted Mesa and the Sanitas or the Goat Trail, we just recently renovated or rehabbed those roads, Sanitas Valley Trail and then Enchanted Mesa. So that's also an approach just to make sure those trails are more resilient and safe to access. And so it's kind of that tiered approach of fuels management, but also access, like Paul mentioned, make sure the firefighters can get in there safely, access the fire and suppress. So just by coincidence, we worked on those roads or trails last season. And then I'll mention too, actually, South Shanahan, speaking of our neighbors in the south, we're working on that trail in the Shanahan Ridge area this year. So where that trail goes up into the, from Cragmore, Lehigh, that whole area is going to be repaired and renovated this season too. So.
Brady, one of their funding sources is the citywide climate tax fund, which has a appropriation for wildfire resilience, and we're all involved in making asks against that fund and making decisions about the prioritization for the funding there as well. So it's another place where some of our work groups funding is coming from and will continue to do so.
And grants, I think, Paul, you received a $200,000 grant to do the cross-boundary fuels mitigation project at Wonderland Lake. So grants are also very effective, and sort of providing us some additional capacity.
Harmon, you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Thanks, John. You know, I think I just have one comment. And it's I know, Jeff, you love it when I put on my designer hat and give advice, but I also know that we share a desire to keep the system looking like the system and not like some sort of piece of the built environment that we're superimposing on nature. And so, piggybacking on your question around how do we do infrastructure improvement on trail closures and Brady's exhortation that we do that, soon without too much study, I think, there are probably some really good ideas like, that we can take from familiar designs like, cattle guards that sit flush to the trail surface. And then, maybe they're hinged and they can pop up out of the ground. A ranger could go out, pop it up, and then, maybe underneath that welded cattle guard is a set of metal signs. One says trail closed, another says, fire danger, another says muddy conditions, so you get the interpretation, you get the physical barrier, you get something that looks like something that we associate with a natural area, and something that disappears when it's not being used, just ideating there. And I hope you, think about stuff like that for how we can get really effective and still keep the system looking like the system.
Mhm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And those are great ideas. I mean, you're right. This whole approach and even internally among our staff and across the community, there's this question of like, should we be closing the system and how do we do that? And are these disrupting the aesthetic of the system or the scenic values and that sort of thing? So again, that's part of this process, is taking a lot of that into consideration. How can it function? How can we be as efficient? And so those are great design ideas that we'll consider. And that's part of looking at some other agencies and what exists out there. We, in fact, recently we worked with some students from School of Mines down in Golden on some cattle guards and crossing different things just to inspire, engage young minds. And so I definitely appreciate those comments and we'll look into that.
Yeah, I'd like to think I still have a young mind.
That's right.
Even if
not
even
that
if the
not
hair
that
on
you're
top
not,
of it isn't brown
yeah,
anymore.
I mean, you're certainly a young mind. We'd love to engage.
So, but another piece that I think is worth just hammering on a little bit is that the things that that sort of become emblematic of a beloved open space system, even if they are fabricated pieces and they're part of the built environment, they create associations with nature. So a good example would be the brown signs that we see on our highways that represent, parkland or national parks. You always see those signs aren't green like the highway signs, they're brown. And so they kind of fade into the whole natural landscape. And they also are something that if you're looking for a place to go hiking, you're looking for a brown sign. The problem that I think we're dealing with now in many ways is a lack of consistency. So, are we looking for police tape? Are we looking for a sign? Are we looking for a whiteboard? Are we looking for an A-frame? A-frames blow over in the wind. I mean, it's really a shame that we actually have this problem, because until the last few years, we didn't have this problem. We didn't have wind closures. We didn't have wind-driven fire like we have now as a constant reminder. But I think putting in physical infrastructure that responds to, unfortunately, what's probably our gosh darn new normal, is worth it. And in doing that, creating something that eventually kind of fades into everybody's association with open space and mountain parks, because it's not terribly intrusive like the brown sign and it's consistent.
Yeah, those are great points. And I've talked about our design guidelines before and just trying to, again, keep that consistent natural aesthetic that's more compatible with the open space system.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely take that into account.
Cool.
And some of it's Brady, I appreciate your comments. I mean, we need to do better. We can do better. You're right. It's purely just trying to do the best we can as quickly as we can. And
and it's also new.
Yeah, it's new. We're figuring it. So it kind of looks, yellow caution tape is not the solution,
Yeah.
road sign. So yeah, great comments, and we're right there with you. I mean, it's something that we talk about, and how do we do this well? So.
Yeah. I mean, if I were you, I would be the first few years you're thinking this is going to go away. We don't have to do permanent infrastructure. This is weird.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we're probably beyond that point right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Morgan.
Well, thanks to you three, and I can well, the newness of it and the speed at which you have to react is just overwhelming, and I imagine there's a lot of weight on your shoulders. And I'm a South Boulder gal, so I could see my house on the map, and I also grew up in Central California in the 80s, and everyone had a suitcase under our bed in case there was a fire. So it's as ingrained as me as it could be. And then for you, public servants, to carry that load for our whole community is a lot. So thank you for your service. And there's nothing more important, I think, right now than keeping people safe. And so for the why, like one of your first slides, Brian, was the why. And those are whys that help you make internal decisions. I'd like you all to work with comms to think through a why that makes sense for people and just be really consistent in it. And I don't, people on open space during high winds can increase the risk of wildfire. Something as simple as that, and that's kind of non-negotiable, and that gives you a framework to share with the public that this might be coming again. And then the internal deliberation and the policy making is a different story, but the public facing piece and just preparing people. And no one wants a fire, and it's not going away. And it's really scary for people, but if they know that this is one of the measures in place to keep people safe, I'd like to see that. And this is kind of a weird question, but in your percentages, do you feel like the risk, or I understand that there's a risk and hazard, but the likelihood of an occurrence, maybe this is for you, Jeff, but is indexed to that decrease in visitation? Like, how happy were you with those numbers, or a 60% decrease, or like, and maybe you're deliberating, but like, what's the ideal?
Yeah, that's kind of a difficult, and I invite Brian and Paul too to chime in. I think it's hard to understand. I mean, we look at it and we internally we're like, oh, this is really encouraging or compelling
There's
that
a lot, yeah.
we were pretty successful. I mean, it certainly changes when you look at when we have gates that can be closed and those hard closures like Brian mentioned. But just looking at the results and the decrease in visitation was like, again, we kind of did this quickly. You know, Hillary and her team Rangers went out there and just did as best they could, and it was very successful in the December event. I think the weather was on our side as well, not on our side, but led to some of the effectiveness.
People stayed home.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's hard to know. I think again, if we do more closures and kind of gauge and just monitor over time and see what level of effectiveness or decrease in visitation, we'll continue to kind of start to have some metrics that say like, yeah, this is probably a good average that we can aim towards, or what were the factors, just like we're doing now with these two events that led to less or more. Again, Chautauqua in March was not as effective as the other event in December. So I don't know that we have a goal metric or target yet, because we're still building this. And again, as we have more, if we could say, well, we do know these areas because of the infrastructure, they were much more reduced visitation. We could project that across these other areas that don't have the infrastructure, and then start to set some metrics and targets in that realm.
And help you with decision making and calibrate the investment and intervention. Yeah, it's just a tool kind of in the toolbox. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, what else? Well, I had a question about what do you need, just so we have context. Like, there's money for it. There's grants. You kind of asked this question too, but I feel a responsibility to ensure that at least we're, to the extent we can, advocate for getting you all what you need across programs and budgets is really important to me. It's hard to say what you need. You're 3 months in to figuring out what this looks like and knowing it's not going to go away. But I just want to reflect, at least for me, like we want to be an ally and at least hearing what you need, budget, staffing.
Yeah.
programming.
Yeah, I would say the deliberation today is one aspect of what we need. I mean, we're all scribbling down, writing ideas, so getting your feedback is one idea of what we need. I think the budgetary and asking the hard questions, that's good for us to get from the community and from this board. Ask the hard questions. It forces us to dive deeper and maybe see angles that we haven't looked at as closely as before. So continue to challenge us. You're also the bridge between us and the community, staff in the community. You're the one tool we use to communicate out to what we're doing. You also are going to get more questions than a typical person would. Once they know on the board, you may get questioned of why are you even closing, or you should close more. I mean, so you're going to have to understand the subject matter because you will be asked. And so having your understanding of helping us communicate out are all ways that we're all working together. And part of that, what how does this board serve this effort? So yeah, those are just some things on the top of my mind.
Well, another good reason to see budgets early so we can ask you, like, what's your response to this?
Yeah, and yes.
Okay, thanks.
I just want, oh, sorry, Bray, I was going to add one thing to the closure metric. I was chatting with Hillary here and she said that our muddy trail program, for example, it's 85%, almost to 100% compliance in some areas, but that has taken years. And really, as you all know, that comes down to the public kind of learning and understanding and supporting. It's a different program. We're, preserving trails and resources, but the public trusting and learning and seeing the benefit of that. So I think Hillary makes a great point because these closures, again, Chautauqua in March was a little rough. I mean, if the community sees the benefit, and like you said, if they see that these can prevent fire or help safety and et cetera, that might, that's part of us getting to better compliance and outcomes. So sorry, Brady.
No, that's fine. John, if I may just add a really quick comment. There will be some of the community who question the assumption that, because we're assuming that the closures are going to reduce fire risk. And I like what you said, Jeff, about how we have to be really careful when we implement these so that we don't undermine the public trust. And so I would really encourage you, when we complete these investigations, these last 3 events, let's be as transparent with the public as we can. And let's maybe just internal thought experiment. Are these the sorts of people, presuming these are people, who would have been captured by a good faith effort to close these areas? Or is it the kind of thing where a closure keeps the good players out and the people who are going to misbehave anyway are the very ones who aren't going to comply? And I think telling that story to the public is going to be important for the potential skeptics.
I'd also add that preventative ignition prevention is one element of it, but there's other strong elements of what goes into consideration. If there's an enhanced likelihood of a fire impacting open space, we don't necessarily want a whole bunch of resources having to clear hundreds of people from our trail. We want to be concentrated on response of getting emergency vehicles in there and not worrying about, well, we got to get the emergency vehicles out while we're dozens, if not hundreds of people are trying to come down the trail. And what's better time for our rangers to be looking at evacuation in the surrounding communities, wildfire response, or to deal with safety crises that are up on their system for people who are still on the system and evacuation. So it's wildfire prevention is one element, but it's not all of it. There's other considerations we're thinking about.
Sorry, John, one more thing. I'm floored that we've had 3 fires in close proximity, and there may be a conclusion that it's human caused, and somehow public education, I don't know, like educate me, like cigarettes. I don't see many people smoking on open. Maybe I just don't hang with the right crowd, or a car, but like what, like off the top of your head, like what are other human causes of a fire?
I would say that let's wait for the investigations to come to the conclusion.
I was being very generally, but
we may learn some more specifics. I could say that I think it's Bluebell is a closed investigation, or one of them was closed and the ruling was undetermined.
Okay. Well, I can learn too, but using that as a starting point for some kind of campaign, like we had 3 fires gosh, God, they weren't worse. And it turns out they may have been human. I don't know what it says, but somehow that's part of the education, I think, too. That's all.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for your questions. I kind of latched on to a similar thing to what Morgan did around messaging. There was a slide in there that talked about why we would want to do the closures, and it talked about protecting natural resources, and uh, I mean, unless I just missed it, I didn't see, public safety as like a reason that we want to close open space, right? On that slide. Um, and again, like internally, right, that might be good for us, but I think it's important to educate the public, about why we're closing it and how serious of a threat fire is. Um, I also think, it's going to be tougher to get the same amount of compliance on trail closures on high wind days as we are with muddy trail closures. Like muddy trail closures are great, right? I don't want to get my boots muddy. I see the sign. I'm like, awesome. I'm not going to go that way, right? There's like a personal benefit for me to comply with that, that sign that tells me not to do it, right? And unless we educate the public on, the threat to public safety and that's why we're closing the trails, I think we are going to struggle with compliance there. So I think as we're messaging it externally, I think, we might want to think about it a little differently than what was presented on the slide.
Thanks, John.
Take us home, Dan.
Well, as usual, in order to get us out of here on time, I cut my verbal updates. So I would say the matters from the department are done. So I'll take it to you to conclude the meeting, John.
Awesome. Well, I will adjourn the April 8th, 2026 OSBT meeting. If someone wants to tap the
On your
gavel
behalf,
for me.
John.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Now that's a vice chair.